Hey there, tonight we're diving into the rise and fall of Julius Caesar, where the truth is that the man who reshaped Rome did so with a mix of genius and sheer audacity. What you're about to discover might just change your view of dictators forever. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise or grab your favorite blanket, and let's drift into tonight's story together. In the bustling, chaotic world of 100 BC Rome, where political backstabbing was as common as a loaf of bread, a future dictator was born. Julius Caesar entered the scene with all the flair of a reality TV star, albeit one who could actually wield a sword. Let's be clear, Caesar wasn't exactly born with a silver spoon in his mouth. His family, the Julii, claimed descent from Venus herself, which in the family tree world is basically like saying you're related to Beyoncé. But despite their celestial bragging rights, the Julii were more on the up-and-coming side of Rome's social ladder. Julius was thrust into a world where the rich played politics like a Roman version of Monopoly, only with more blood and less paper money. Rome was a republic in theory, but a battleground in practice, with power plays that would make modern politicians blush. You see, there was this little issue of the Senate being puppeteered by some of the wealthiest families, and young Julius took note. He was a keen observer, even as a teenager, watching and learning from the sidelines, biding his time like a chess player waiting to checkmate a king. But before Caesar became the suave political operator we know, and well, slightly fear, he had to survive his teenage years. No small feat in ancient Rome. At 60, Caesar was already navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics, thanks in large part to his uncle, Gaius Marius, a 7-time consul, and the kind of general who made badass look inadequate. Marius was embroiled in a bitter feud with Lucius Cornelius Sulla, another power-hungry general with the charming habit of prescription, essentially a legal hit list, where the fortunate got a one-way ticket out of Rome, and the not-so-fortunate got a sword to the heart. Now, young Julius found himself engaged to a girl named Carsucha, but political winds shifted faster than a Roman chariot, and he was soon betrothed to Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, one of Marius's allies. It was a match made in political heaven, or at least in the Senate's backrooms. Then Sulla took control of Rome and demanded Caesar divorce Cornelia. Here's where the legend begins to take shape. Caesar refused. Imagine this, a teenager standing up to the most powerful man in Rome. Sulla, not known for his patience or mercy, begrudgingly let Caesar off the hook, reportedly muttering that he saw many Mariuses in this boy. As if family drama wasn't enough, Caesar's life took a turn for the cinematic when he was kidnapped by pirates in 75 BC. Yes, pirates, and not the Johnny Depp kind, but the real, cutthroat variety, who demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, around $600,000 in today's money. Caesar, unimpressed by their audacity, laughed in their faces and insisted they demand 50 talents instead. He spent his captivity treating his captors like a captive audience, dictating poems and speeches, and threatening to crucify them once freed. The pirates, charmed by his bravado, let him go upon receiving the ransom. True to his word, Caesar returned with a fleet, captured the pirates, and, well, crucified them. Talk about a punchline. With that adventure behind him, Caesar returned to Rome, where he began his climb up the cursus honorum, the sequential order of public offices held by aspiring politicians. He was elected military tribune, and then quaestor, roles that gave him a taste of power and the sweet aroma of ambition. But unlike many of his peers, Caesar wasn't content with just playing the game. He wanted to rewrite the rules. He threw lavish games and public spectacles, a move that endeared him to the masses while emptying his pockets. His debts piled up faster than you could say, "Hail Caesar," but his popularity soared. Here's where the myth gets a gloss of reality. Caesar was essentially a populist with a knack for drama. He understood that Rome loved a good show, and he was more than willing to play the lead role. But his ascent wasn't just about charisma. It was about timing, alliances, and a ruthless streak that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. The political climate was ripe for change, and Caesar had no intention of being a mere spectator. So there he was, a young man with debts up to his eyeballs, a flair for the dramatic, and an ambition that stretched from the Roman Forum to the stars. He was ready to take on the world, one calculated move at a time. And this, my friends, was only the beginning of the legend, a story that would eventually shape the course of history and leave a legacy as enduring as the empire he would once rule. Caesar was on the rise, and Rome would never be the same. Caesar was on the rise, and Rome would never be the same. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This was no overnight success story. Climbing the Roman political ladder was more like scaling a sheer cliff face with a sack of debts tied to your back. And Caesar, ever the ambitious climber, knew he needed to make some powerful friends and a lot of money if he was going to reach the top. Enter Caesar, the military tribune, a title that sounds like it should come with a helmet and a sword, but was more a political stepping stone than a battlefield promotion. As a military tribune, Caesar got a front row seat to Rome's military machine, which was less about glory and more about logistics and grit. This role was crucial. It gave him access to the army's inner workings, and more importantly, helped him build connections with soldiers and officers, a network that would pay dividends when he needed them most. But Caesar wasn't merely content with military accolades. He had his eyes set on Rome's religious and political arenas, where a different kind of power was wielded. Fast forward a few years, and we find Caesar elected as Pontifex Maximus in 63 BC, the chief priest of the Roman state religion. Now, before you imagine him in flowing robes blessing crowds from a balcony, let's put this in context. The role was as much about politics as it was about piety. Sure, it involved overseeing religious ceremonies, but it also came with a swanky residence and a platform to influence Rome's movers and shakers. At the ripe old age of 37, Caesar had snagged a position typically reserved for older, seasoned politicians. How? By playing the political game like a maestro. He knew how to pull the heartstrings and purse strings of Rome's elite, a skill that came in handy when he needed to fund his lavish lifestyle and political campaigns. Yes, Caesar was a big spender. His financial strategy was the ancient equivalent of maxing out a dozen credit cards to bankroll a political career. He borrowed money like a college kid with rich parents, securing loans from wealthy backers like Crassus, Rome's richest man, and possibly the only one who could bail Caesar out of his fiscal mess. Crassus, with his vast silver mines and real estate empire, was crucial in keeping Caesar afloat, and Caesar, with his magnetic charisma and political savvy, was just the investment Crassus needed to maintain his grip on power. It was a symbiotic relationship, really. One had the money, the other the ambition. Caesar's personal life was no less complex. After his marriage to Cornelia, he tied the knot with Pompey, a union that was more strategic than romantic. But that didn't last. Their separation came after a scandalous incident involving a man named Clodius Pulcher, who allegedly disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a religious ceremony hosted by Pompey. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, divorced her, stating that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, a neat way to sidestep scandal while keeping his political image squeaky clean. But the marital headlines didn't stop there. Enter Cleopatra, the Egyptian queen whose allure was as legendary as Caesar's ambition. Picture this: a young, intelligent ruler navigating the treacherous waters of Egyptian politics, using her charm to forge alliances. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, the two formed a connection that was as politically advantageous as it was romantic. Cleopatra needed a powerful ally to secure her throne, and Caesar, well, he was never one to shy away from a dazzling alliance. Their affair was the talk of the town, or rather two towns, as it bridged the gap between Rome and Alexandria. The union produced a son, Caesarion, whose very existence was a political statement. But let's not romanticize too much. This wasn't just a love story. It was a strategic alliance that expanded Caesar's influence into the heart of Egypt, a land rich in resources and intrigue. Cleopatra, with her wit and political acumen, was a partner who complemented Caesar's ambitions. Together, they were the power couple of the ancient world, each using the other's strengths to fortify their own positions. Through all this, Caesar never lost sight of his ultimate goal: power. He understood the game of Roman politics better than most, and he was willing to take risks that would make even the boldest senators blanch. Whether it was his daring debt strategy or his audacious alliances, Caesar knew that fortune favored the bold and the well-connected. His ability to maneuver through Rome's political labyrinth was nothing short of genius, a testament to his understanding of human nature and the power of perception. So, as Caesar continued his ascent, he wasn't just amassing titles and accolades. He was reshaping the very fabric of Roman society. By blending the personal with the political, he crafted a legacy that would outlive him by millennia. But as we know, the higher you climb, the further there is to fall. Caesar's story was far from over, and the stakes were only getting higher. Stay tuned, because the plot is about to thicken. Speaking of thickening plots, let's dive headlong into Caesar's greatest hits, the Gallic Wars. If you've ever thought about conquering the world in a casual weekend kind of way, Caesar is your guy. It's 58 BC, and our ambitious Roman decides it's time to expand Rome's horizons, or at least his own wallet and reputation, by taking on Gaul. Now, Gaul was no small fry. It covered modern-day France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland, Italy, the Netherlands, and Germany. Think of it as Europe's most unruly HOA, in desperate need of a new president. Caesar's campaign in Gaul lasted 8 years, and was nothing short of a logistical opera. He commanded legions, not just a few good men, but an entire army system that could rival any modern corporation. We're talking about 50,000 Roman soldiers marching around 10,000 miles, across rivers and mountains, through weather that would test even the most dedicated mailman. And they weren't just marching for the cardio. They were there to conquer, subdue, and yes, loot. The spoils of war were no joke. Caesar sent back to Rome a jaw-dropping 1,000 pounds of silver, along with gold, slaves, and other treasures that made him the ancient equivalent of a Fortune 500 CEO. But why Gaul, you ask? Well, besides the obvious allure of riches and glory, there were political stakes at play. Rome was a republic with a fondness for military success stories. Victories meant votes, and Caesar needed to bolster his resume if he wanted to keep climbing that political ladder. The Senate, with its crusty old senators clutching their togas like pearls, was both an audience and an adversary. So off he went, armed with ambition and an army. Now, let's talk tactics. Caesar was a military genius, no doubt about it. His strategy was as much about psychological warfare as it was about swords and shields. He built bridges in record time, literally. In 10 days, his engineers constructed a bridge over the Rhine River, a feat that was part engineering marvel, part show of force. It sent a clear message to the Germanic tribes. We can reach you, and we're not afraid to do it. The tribes got the message loud and clear, and Caesar burned the bridge behind him once done, just in case anyone thought about following him back to Gaul. But the Gallic Wars were not just about clever tactics and bridge building. The campaign was brutal. Caesar's forces faced fierce resistance from the Gallic tribes, who weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. The most famous of these was the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC, where Caesar faced off against Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who tried to unite the tribes against the Roman invaders. Picture this. Vercingetorix holed up in a fortified hilltop town, surrounded by Caesar's forces. Meanwhile, a Gallic relief army is coming to the rescue. Caesar's solution: build a circumvallation, an 11-mile-long wall around Alesia to keep Vercingetorix in and another wall to keep the relieving Gallic forces out. It was a siege within a siege, and Caesar played it like a maestro. The battle was a bloodbath, with tens of thousands of Gauls killed or captured. Vercingetorix himself was taken prisoner, later paraded through Rome in Caesar's triumph before being executed. Not exactly a happy ending for the Gauls, but a resounding victory for Rome. Back in Rome, Caesar's success in Gaul was both a blessing and a curse. Sure, he was hailed as a hero, but his growing power made the Senate uncomfortable. You could almost hear the collective gulp as they realized Caesar was amassing both military might and popular support that could topple the status quo. Enter the first triumvirate, a political alliance with Pompey and Crassus that was shakier than a Roman chariot on cobblestones. On the surface, it looked solid, 3 powerhouses pooling their resources, but underneath it was a powder keg. Pompey, once Caesar's son-in-law and ally, was getting increasingly jealous of Caesar's growing popularity. Crassus, the moneybag of the trio, was eyeing Parthia for his own military glory, a plan that would end in disaster. The alliance's dissolution was as dramatic as a Roman tragedy. Crassus's death in 53 BC during the Battle of Carrhae against the Parthians was the first blow. With Crassus out of the picture, Pompey and Caesar's relationship soured faster than milk in the Mediterranean sun. The Senate, ever the schemers, saw an opportunity to pit the two against each other. They backed Pompey, hoping he'd be the safer bet to maintain their grip on power. Caesar, meanwhile, was ordered to disband his army and return to Rome. But disband wasn't in Caesar's vocabulary. He wasn't about to give up his power or his legions without a fight. And so, in 49 BC, Caesar made the fateful decision to cross the Rubicon River, a literal and figurative point of no return. With one small step, he declared war on Rome itself, setting into motion a civil conflict that would change the Republic forever. As the saying goes, alia iacta est, the die is cast. Caesar's gamble was a bold move, but bold was his middle name, or it would have been if Romans had middle names. The civil war that followed was a clash of titans, with Caesar and Pompey fighting for the soul of Rome. This was no ordinary power struggle. It was a battle of ideologies, of visions for Rome's future. Caesar represented change, a break from the rigid structures of the Republic. Pompey, with the Senate's backing, stood for the old guard, for tradition and stability. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the outcome would shape the Roman world for centuries to come. So there we leave Caesar, on the brink of a new chapter, his fate intertwined with that of the Roman Republic. The story is far from over, and the twists and turns ahead promise to be as epic as any drama ever staged in the Colosseum. Stay tuned, because the curtain is about to rise on the next act of this Roman saga. As the curtain rises on this pivotal chapter of Roman history, Caesar stands at the Rubicon, the river that marks the border between the Roman province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. Crossing it with an armed force is tantamount to declaring war on the Senate and the Republic itself. It's the kind of dramatic moment that Hollywood loves to over-dramatize, but here's the kicker. It was just as tense as it sounds. With one small step, Caesar uttered the now famous phrase, alia iacta est, the die is cast, sealing his fate and that of Rome. Forget removing a monopoly hotel. Caesar was flipping the entire board. Caesar's march on Rome was nothing short of audacious. With a loyal army of about 50,000 battle-hardened veterans from the Gallic Wars, he headed south. His old buddy, Pompey, and the Senate were caught with their togas down. They scrambled in panic, abandoning Rome faster than you can say cancel in crisis. Pompey, ever the cautious strategist, retreated to the south of Italy to regroup and recruit more troops. Meanwhile, Caesar entered Rome unopposed, a conqueror in his own city. But don't be fooled, this wasn't a victory lap. It was a strategic pause to shore up political support and send a message. Rome was under new management. The civil war that followed was the ancient equivalent of a heavyweight boxing match, with Caesar and Pompey as the prize-fighters. Pompey had the backing of the Senate and the resources of the eastern provinces. Caesar, on the other hand, had his legions and a knack for high-stakes gambles. The two titans clashed at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, a showdown that would determine the future of Rome. Pompey's forces outnumbered Caesar's, but Caesar had the advantage of experience and the loyalty of his troops. He delivered a tactical masterclass, using a surprise cavalry attack to break Pompey's lines. The result, a stunning victory for Caesar and a hasty retreat for Pompey, who fled to Egypt seeking refuge. Now, if you thought Pompey would find a warm welcome in Egypt, think again. The Egyptian court, embroiled in its own Game of Thrones, saw Pompey as a liability. Seeking to curry favor with Caesar, they assassinated Pompey upon his arrival, presenting his head to Caesar as a twisted gift. Caesar, for all his ruthlessness, was reportedly appalled. He had lost a rival, but also a former ally. This kind of backstabbing was a stark reminder that in politics, as in war, trust was a rare commodity. With Pompey out of the picture, Caesar turned his attention to consolidating power. But he wasn't just a military man. He was also a shrewd politician who understood the power of public perception. He embarked on a series of reforms aimed at winning over the common people and stabilizing the economy. He restructured debt, expanded the Senate to include representatives from across the Roman territories, and implemented the Julian calendar, which, fun fact, is the basis for the calendar we use today. These moves were not just about governance. They were calculated PR stunts to cement his legacy as a benevolent ruler. Of course, not everyone was buying what Caesar was selling. The Senate, reduced in power and prestige, saw him as a dictator in all but name. They weren't too thrilled about being sidelined, and whispers of a conspiracy began to circulate. But Caesar, ever the showman, was adept at turning enemies into allies, until he couldn't anymore. His growing power was a double-edged sword, and the Senate was sharpening theirs. The myth of Caesar as a ruthless dictator is both true and misleading. Yes, he held absolute power, but he also enacted reforms that laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire. He redistributed land, increased soldiers' pay, and extended citizenship to people in far-flung provinces. These were radical changes for a republic that had become synonymous with elite privilege. But such radical shifts came with radical opposition. Many senators felt that Caesar was dismantling the republic's very foundations. They couldn't quite see that the republic was already crumbling under its own weight. Economically, Caesar's reign was a mixed bag. The influx of wealth from his conquests in Gaul and elsewhere had temporarily bolstered the economy, but it also highlighted the republic's reliance on expansion and plunder. This wasn't a sustainable model, and Caesar knew it. His reforms aimed to create a more stable economic base, but change is never easy, especially when it threatens the status quo. Now, let's talk about Caesar's knack for PR. He was the ancient world's first celebrity general, chronicling his exploits in the Gallic Wars with a flair for drama that would make any modern spin doctor envious. These commentaries were not just military reports. They were crafted narratives that portrayed Caesar as a hero of the people, a man of destiny. They were so effective that they became required reading in Roman schools, ensuring that future generations would know Caesar not just as a conqueror, but as a statesman. But the flip side of being a legend in your own time is that you make a lot of enemies. Caesar's centralization of power, while popular with the masses, was deeply unsettling to the Senate. They saw in him a king in all but name, and for a republic born from the ashes of monarchy, that was a red line. The conspiracy against him grew, fueled by fear, jealousy, and a genuine belief that they were saving the republic. As we inch closer to the Ides of March, it's worth remembering that Caesar's story is not just about military campaigns and political maneuvers. It's a tale of ambition, hubris, and the perpetual struggle between change and tradition. Caesar's legacy is a complex one, a blend of visionary leadership and ruthless ambition. His reforms reshaped Rome, but his unchecked power sowed the seeds of his downfall. So, as we leave Caesar standing at the height of his power, the shadows of conspiracy begin to loom large. The stage is set for the next act, where the stakes are higher and the players more desperate. The fall of Julius Caesar is a story of betrayal and the harsh realities of power, a tale as old as time and as relevant as ever. Stay tuned, because history is about to take a dramatic turn, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. As we stand on the precipice of history's next dramatic act, the stage is set for the Ides of March, a date that would forever echo through the annals of time. It's March 1544 BC, and Julius Caesar, the man who reshaped Rome with both a sword and a quill, is about to face his ultimate reckoning. The conspiracy against him has been simmering like a pot of Roman stew, with a mix of senators and disgruntled elites stirring the pot. The plot to assassinate Caesar wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a carefully orchestrated plan. It was the brainchild of around 60 senators, including the infamous Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. These weren't just any senators. They were men with a pedigree, a chip on their shoulder, and a genuine belief that they were the Republic's last line of defense against tyranny. Brutus, in particular, had a complicated relationship with Caesar, who treated him like a son. But as Shakespeare would have it, et tu, Brute, became the ultimate betrayal line. The conspiracy had one goal: to save the Republic from Caesar's perceived ambition to crown himself king. Ironically, the title king was anathema to Romans, who prided themselves on their republic, even though it was now a republic in name only. Caesar had been offered a crown during the Lupercalia festival by Mark Antony, and while he theatrically refused it, the gesture was enough to ignite fears of monarchy. It was like waving a red flag in front of a bull, only this bull had a toga and a legion of loyal followers. On that fateful day, Caesar was warned by a soothsayer to beware the Ides of March, but in a twist of fate, or hubris, he dismissed the warning. Hubris, dear listeners, the fatal flaw that has toppled many a great figure. As Caesar entered the theater of Pompey for a Senate meeting, he was surrounded by conspirators. The attack was brutal, with Caesar reportedly stabbed 23 times. It was more of a frenzy than a surgical strike, with each senator eager to prove his loyalty to the cause of the Republic. The irony. In their attempt to save the Republic, they inadvertently set the stage for its transformation into an empire. Caesar's assassination sent shockwaves through Rome. His death wasn't a neat ending, but the start of a chaotic power struggle. Rome was a city in mourning or celebration, depending on where you stood. The public, who adored Caesar for his populist reforms and military victories, were outraged. The Senate, however, was in a state of nervous relief, having rid themselves of a dictator, but unsure of what came next. You see, eliminating a figurehead doesn't erase the system or the supporters in place. It just creates a power vacuum. And nature, as we know, abhors a vacuum. Into this void stepped Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, and a man who knew how to work a crowd. At Caesar's funeral, Antony delivered a speech that turned the people against the conspirators. It was a masterclass in rhetoric, weaving in Caesar's will, which generously left money to every Roman citizen, with a reminder of his military prowess. The people, swayed by Antony's words, turned on the conspirators, forcing them to flee Rome. The aftermath of Caesar's assassination was a brutal power struggle that saw the rise of the Second Triumvirate: Antony, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and Lepidus. But this alliance was as short-lived as a Roman summer. Octavian, the astute young upstart, outmaneuvered Antony and Lepidus, paving his path to become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. The Republic was dead, and in its place stood the Roman Empire, a regime that would last for centuries, shaping the course of Western history. Now, let's talk legacy. Caesar's life and death left an indelible mark on Rome and beyond. His assassination is often romanticized as a noble act to save a dying republic, but the reality is messier. The conspirators, while genuinely concerned about dictatorship, failed to grasp that the republic was already crumbling under its own contradictions. It was an oligarchy masquerading as a democracy, with power concentrated in the hands of a few elite families. Caesar, for all his faults, was a symptom, not the disease. Economically, Caesar's regime had attempted to address the inequities that plagued Rome. His debt reforms and land distribution policies aimed to stabilize a society teetering on the brink of class warfare. But these measures were band-aids on a deeper wound: Rome's reliance on expansion and plunder to fuel its economy. The empire that followed would continue this pattern, but on a grander scale. In terms of governance, Caesar's centralization of power laid the groundwork for the imperial system that would follow. His expansion of the Senate was less about democracy and more about diluting the old guard's influence. But it also set a precedent for a more inclusive Rome, where provincial elites could aspire to power. This was a double-edged sword, fostering unity, but also sowing the seeds of future conflicts. So, was Caesar a dictator or a visionary? The answer, as with most things in history, is complicated. He was a man of contradictions, both a ruthless conqueror and a reformer, a populist and an autocrat. His story is a reminder that history is rarely black and white, often painted in shades of grey by the victors and the vanquished alike. In the end, Caesar's legacy is both a cautionary tale and a blueprint. His life exemplifies the intoxicating allure and peril of power, the thin line between hero and villain, and the eternal struggle between change and tradition. His death marked the end of the Roman Republic and the dawn of an empire, a transformation that would ripple through time. And while the Ides of March has become synonymous with betrayal, it also serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of human ambition and the ever-present shadows of those who seek to shape the world in their image. Caesar's tale is as much about us as it is about him, a testament to the enduring dance of power, politics, and the human condition. As the sun peaks over the horizon, another day begins in the dusty world of medieval stonemasonry, where you, dear listener, are the underappreciated architect of dreams. While others dream of their morning porridge, you're already knee-deep in grit and sweat, because building a cathedral isn't just about divine inspiration. It's about the sheer grind of human endurance. Forget the romanticized image of a master artist chiseling away at a block of marble. Your reality is less Michelangelo and more medieval construction worker with a side of back-breaking labor. Welcome to your apprenticeship, that 7-year sentence. Oops, I meant commitment. That's going to transform you from a naive stone chipper into a seasoned craftsman. Or that's the sales pitch, anyway. In truth, you're more likely to spend your days hauling stones and mixing lime mortar than creating architectural wonders. They didn't tell you that in the recruitment brochure, did they? But fear not, because the payoff is, well, let's just say it's not exactly a golden handshake, more like a handful of pence a day. Specifically, you're looking at about 2 to 3 pence, which in the grand scheme of things is barely enough to keep you in ale and gruel. Now, let's talk about those working hours. If you think your modern 9 to 5 is tough, try the medieval sunrise to sunset, which in the summer could mean a solid 14-hour day. And you're not clocking out at 5 p.m. to catch happy hour. Your reward is a cot in a drafty communal dormitory shared with other apprentices who snore like they're trying to bring the walls down faster than you can build them. Forget privacy. In fact, forget personal space altogether. Your life is now a never-ending episode of Survivor, Mason's Guild Edition. And speaking of guilds, these were your medieval version of a trade union, but with more pageantry and fewer rights. They controlled everything from your training to your wages, and they were as much about maintaining the status quo as they were about advancing the craft. Think of it as the ultimate gatekeeper. You can't just decide you're going to be a master mason one day. Oh no, you have to earn it through sweat, tears, and likely a few crushed fingers. By the time you're done, you're not just building cathedrals, you're building character, whether you like it or not. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, you need to survive the apprenticeship. And to do that, you need skills, real skills. Because let's face it, the difference between a stunning piece of architecture and a pile of rubble is a few inches of miscalculation. One wrong move with the mallet and you've got yourself a medieval disaster. No pressure, right? Your master will drill this into you with all the grace of a boot camp sergeant. Accuracy is king, and your chisel is your scepter. Wield it wisely, or prepare for a royal chewing out. So, here you are, chipping away at your apprenticeship, day by day, stone by stone, in a world that's as unforgiving as the granite beneath your feet. It's not all doom and gloom, though. There's a camaraderie among your fellow masons, a shared understanding that comes from knowing you're all in this together. Plus, you're part of something bigger, something that will stand for centuries as a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance. Or at least, that's what you tell yourself as you drag your aching body to bed each night. In the end, being a medieval stonemason is a bit like being the unsung hero of a blockbuster movie. Sure, the knights and kings get all the glory, but without your hard work, they'd be holding court in a soggy field. And while future generations may never know your name, they will gaze in awe at the cathedrals and castles you helped create, marveling at the sheer audacity of their design. So chin up, stonemason. Your legacy is set in stone, quite literally, even if your back is permanently bent from the effort. And speaking of stone, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of what it actually takes to turn a pile of rocks into a Gothic masterpiece. Spoiler alert, it involves a lot less magic and a lot more muscle than you might think. Welcome to the world of medieval tools, where your toolkit is as bare bones as the diet of a peasant during Lent. Forget high-tech machinery or even the humble wheelbarrow. No, you're going to be relying on the not-so-high-tech trifecta of chisels, mallets, and ropes. Basically, the medieval equivalent of duct tape and WD-40. First up, the chisel. This little beauty is your go-to for just about everything. Need to carve intricate designs into stone? Chisel. Need to shape a block to fit into the wall? Chisel. Need to vent your frustration after a particularly grueling day? Well, maybe not the chisel, but you get the idea. And here's the kicker. These weren't some mass-produced, get them on sale at your local megastore kind of tools. Nope, you either bought them from a local blacksmith, or if your purse was as empty as your stomach after skipping breakfast, you made them yourself. That's right, your job description just expanded to include amateur metalworker. Then there's the mallet, your trusty sidekick in the daily dance of stone shaping. Think of it as the Batman to your chisel's Robin. Together, they hammer out the details of your work, one painstaking tap at a time. But don't let the simplicity fool you. Wielding these tools with precision is an art form in itself, requiring the kind of finesse that makes threading a needle seem like child's play. And speaking of play, these tools were anything but. A wrong swing could mean a shattered stone, or, worse, a shattered bone. Safety gear, as mythical as a unicorn. Rounding out the trio is the humble rope. In the age before cranes and forklifts, ropes were your lifeline, literally. They hauled, lifted, and occasionally failed spectacularly, sending stones tumbling to the ground in a cloud of dust and swear words. Picture this, you and your fellow masons, a human pulley system, hoisting blocks that weighed more than your average warhorse. It's not just weightlifting, it's a team sport, where teamwork is the difference between success and a catastrophe that could leave you with more than just a bruised ego. Now, let's talk architecture. Those soaring arches and flying buttresses of Gothic cathedrals, they're not just there to impress the folks down at the local tavern. These innovations were born out of necessity, a direct response to the limitations and capabilities of your toolkit. The pointed arches allowed for taller, thinner walls which meant bigger windows and more light, the medieval Instagram filter. But here's the catch. These marvels of engineering were only possible because of the relentless precision of your chisel and mallet. One wrong cut, and the whole thing could come crashing down faster than a juggler with buttered fingers. And let's not forget the economic side of things. With tools this basic, time really was money, or at least pennies. Every chip and crack had to be done with the utmost efficiency, because the longer it took to finish a project, the longer you went without a decent wage. Remember, you're making about 2 to 3 pence a day, barely enough to keep yourself afloat in the river of medieval poverty. So, when your master barks at you to pick up the pace, it's not just about getting the job done, it's about survival. The faster you work, the sooner you can move on to the next gig, and hopefully, with a little luck, start saving enough to buy a new chisel before yours snaps in half. Injuries, they were as common as the morning sun. When your entire job is based on lifting, chipping, and hauling, it's not a question of if you'll get hurt, but when. And with no medieval OSHA to call, you just had to grit your teeth and carry on. Broken fingers, crushed toes, and the occasional concussion were just part of the job description. Yet somehow, the work got done. Cathedrals rose, castles stood proud, and all because of your blood, sweat, and tears, sometimes literally. This is the reality of your daily grind, where the romance of Gothic architecture meets the harsh truth of medieval labor. It's not for the faint-hearted, but then again, neither is anything worthwhile. So keep your chisel sharp and your spirits sharper, because tomorrow is another day, and those stones aren't going to shape themselves. So tomorrow comes, and you're back at it, wielding your chisel and mallet like a medieval maestro. But hold up, before you get lost in another day of back-breaking labor, let's pull back the curtain on the guilds, the medieval version of a LinkedIn network, but with more cloak and dagger theatrics and less polished headshots. Guilds were a bit like the Swiss Army knife of medieval trade life. They offered protection, training, and a dash of social prestige, all while ensuring you didn't end up undercutting your fellow masons and turning the whole trade into a medieval version of a Walmart price war. But don't get too cozy with this romanticized image of camaraderie and brotherhood. Behind the scenes, guilds could be just as cutthroat as a Game of Thrones episode. If you thought high school cliques were bad, try navigating the medieval politics of a guild hall. Sure, on the surface, these guilds were all about unity and strength in numbers. They had the power to negotiate wages, enforce quality standards, and regulate the influx of new apprentices, making sure the market wasn't flooded with amateur stone chippers looking to make a quick buck. But here's where things get tricky. Guilds also enforced strict hierarchies and rules that could make the path to becoming a master mason feel like climbing Everest without a Sherpa. One wrong move in the political game, and you could find yourself stuck in apprentice purgatory longer than your 7-year stint. And let's not ignore the guild meetings, a mix of solemn rituals and political maneuvering, complete with secret handshakes and oaths that would make a modern-day fraternity look like a knitting circle. These meetings were the ultimate stage for backroom deals and alliances, where today's friend could be tomorrow's rival. It's like Survivor, but with more limestone dust and less sunscreen. The guild had its perks, though. It was your ticket to legitimacy, the medieval stamp of approval that separated the true craftsmen from the wannabes. But this came at a cost. You had to pay dues, literally. Every mason shelled out a portion of their hard-earned pence to keep the guild running, a sort of medieval subscription service with no cancel-anytime policy. And heaven forbid you get on the wrong side of the guild masters, those gatekeepers of the profession whose favor could make or break your career faster than you can say, flying buttress. Let's not forget the biggest myth of all, the supposed brotherhood. While the idea of a tight-knit community of masons sounds appealing, the truth was often less idyllic. Competition was fierce, and rivalries could turn as sour as a batch of medieval ale left out in the sun. Everyone was vying for the same limited number of juicy contracts, and let's just say the tactics weren't always above board. Need proof? Look no further than the infamous cathedrals of England, where rival towns would sometimes sabotage each other's projects to claim bragging rights for the tallest spire. Nothing says brotherly love like a bit of industrial espionage. In this dog-eat-dog world, secrecy was the name of the game. The techniques and methods that were the bread and butter of the trade were closely guarded secrets, passed down through cryptic symbols and whispered instructions. The fear of someone stealing your carefully honed skills was real, and sharing too much could leave you out in the cold, figuratively and literally. But why all this cloak and dagger? Well, knowledge was power. And in a world where literacy wasn't exactly a common skill, knowing how to cut stone the right way could elevate you from peasant to respected tradesman. It was your intellectual property, and protecting it was paramount. So, while the myth paints a picture of a brotherhood united under a banner of shared purpose, the reality was more like a game of chess, where each move had to be calculated and strategic. Despite all this, the guilds did provide a sense of identity and belonging in a world where the line between survival and destitution was thinner than a wafer at a medieval mass. They gave you a fighting chance to carve out a life, pun intended, amidst the chaos and uncertainty of medieval society. And for all their faults, they laid the groundwork for modern trade unions and professional organizations, which, let's be honest, are still playing the same political games, just with fancier titles and less dust. So, as the sun sets on another day of chiseling and politicking, you find yourself caught in a web of alliances and rivalries, all while trying to keep your craft and your back intact. The guild is your lifeline and your leash, a double-edged sword that you must wield with care. Because in the world of medieval stonemasonry, nothing is ever as simple as it seems, and the only thing set in stone is the work itself. And speaking of things that are never as simple as they seem, let's dive headfirst into the economic swamp of medieval stonemasonry. If you thought your job was tough, wait till you hear about the financial roller coaster you're strapped into. We're talking about a world where your paycheck is as stable as a tightrope walker in a windstorm. Forget budgeting apps and retirement plans. You're just trying to make it through the week without starving or getting crushed by a falling stone. First up, let's talk raw materials. These didn't just magically appear at your worksite like some Middle Ages Amazon delivery. No, stone had to be quarried, transported and paid for, each step a potential drain on resources and a source of stress. Depending on the project, you might be working with limestone, sandstone, or even marble if someone upstairs was feeling particularly extravagant. Each type came with its own price tag and its own set of challenges. Limestone was kind of the IKEA of stones, affordable and relatively easy to work with. But marble, that was the Gucci of the medieval world, reserved for those projects with a budget as grand as a cathedral spire. Now, if you think modern supply chains are complicated, imagine trying to get a shipment of stone from a quarry 100 miles away, over roads that could barely be called paths, using nothing but oxen and sheer willpower. Each hiccup in this process could mean delays, and delays meant cost overruns. And guess who was often left holding the bag when budgets went south? Yeah, you and your fellow masons, whose wages were more variable than a medieval weather forecast. Speaking of wages, these were as inconsistent as a juggler with a blindfold. Depending on where you were working, and for whom, you might earn anywhere from 2 to 6 pence a day. In today's terms, that wouldn't even buy you a cup of coffee, let alone pay for your room at the local inn. And heaven help you if you were working on a project funded by the church or some cash-strapped local lord. Their purse strings were tighter than a miser's grip, and when funds ran dry, so did your pay. Of course, all these financial woes were exacerbated by the whims of the powers that be. Royal decrees, church edicts, and even wars could turn your economic landscape into a minefield overnight. Take, for instance, the 100 Years' War, more like the 100 years of economic chaos. When the crown needed cash for the war effort, taxes went up, and your already meager earnings took a nosedive. Suddenly, that 3 pence a day looked more like 2, and you were left figuring out how to stretch your gruel a little thinner. And then there was the Black Death, the grim reaper of job security. When it swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it didn't just decimate the population. It also caused labor shortages that turned the job market on its head. If you were lucky enough to survive, you might have found yourself in higher demand, as the sudden scarcity of skilled labor gave workers a rare upper hand. But this was a double-edged sword. While some masons saw their wages increase, others found themselves out of work as projects were abandoned and towns were left in ruins. In this unpredictable economic climate, some masons did manage to rise above the grind. How, you ask? Well, a few savvy souls turned their skills into stepping stones, pun totally intended, to greater wealth and status. By mastering not just the craft, but the art of networking, they could secure lucrative commissions and even land themselves cushy positions as master masons. These were the rock stars of their time, overseeing grand projects and hobnobbing with the elite. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of celebrity architects, with all the prestige and none of the paparazzi. But for every mason who made it big, there were dozens more who toiled in relative obscurity, their contributions forgotten by history. And yet, they kept at it, driven by the hope that maybe, just maybe, their next project would be the one that secured their legacy, or at least put a decent meal on the table. And then there's the whole beer-for-payment scheme. Yes, you heard that right. Sometimes, when cash was scarce, masons were paid in ale, a move that sounds more like a frat party gone medieval than a serious economic policy. While this might sound like a dream come true for some, the reality was far less glamorous. After all, you can't pay rent with a barrel of beer, nor can you trade it for a new pair of boots. It was a temporary fix at best, and a logistical nightmare at worst, especially when you realized that there's only so much ale one can consume before productivity and consciousness declines precipitously. It's a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of these craftsmen that, despite all these challenges, they managed to create structures of such enduring beauty and complexity. Their work was a labor of love, sweat, and at times, desperation. So next time you find yourself marveling at a medieval cathedral, take a moment to appreciate the economic tightrope walk that made it possible. Because behind every soaring spire and intricate carving is a story of survival against the odds, a tribute to those who carved not just stone, but a place for themselves in history. So, as you stand there marveling at that medieval cathedral, it's time to appreciate the legacy of those stonemasons who, despite battling a constant economic storm and the whims of fate, laid the very foundation of Europe's iconic skyline. These unsung heroes chipped away at the bedrock of history, one stone at a time, creating a legacy that's as solid as, well, the structures they built. First, let's talk about that skyline. Those towering spires, intricate facades, and majestic arches weren't the result of some overnight miracle, but a testament to decades, sometimes centuries, of relentless labor. Imagine this. The construction of the Notre Dame de Paris began in 1163 and wasn't completed until 1345. That's a whopping 182 years, longer than most medieval lifespans. You could start as an apprentice and retire as a master mason without ever seeing the finished product. It was a generational relay race, with each craftsman handing off their chisel to the next, all in the name of creating something larger than themselves. But why did these masons endure such grueling work? For some, it was the chance to leave their mark on history, to create something that would outlast them by centuries. In an era before selfies and social media fame, building a cathedral was the medieval equivalent of going viral. It was a way to achieve immortality, even if your name was lost to the annals of time, overshadowed by the grandeur of your creation. Beyond the personal satisfaction, there was also a sense of community pride involved. These projects weren't just religious or royal commissions, they were civic undertakings. Towns rallied around the construction of their cathedrals, seeing them as symbols of local prestige and cultural identity. They weren't just building structures, they were building legacies. The pride of a town was often reflected in its ability to erect grand monuments, and stonemasons were the artisans who turned those civic dreams into reality. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. The romantic image of the lone genius sculptor, chiseling away in solitude, is about as accurate as a medieval map of the world. In truth, stonemasonry was a collaborative effort, a symphony of hands working in concert. Master masons might design the overarching plan, but it was the combined work of hundreds of laborers, craftsmen, and apprentices that brought those designs to life. It was an intricate dance of skill, precision, and teamwork, more akin to a Broadway production than a solo performance. Moreover, despite the hardships, many masons found the work deeply fulfilling. There was a unique satisfaction in transforming raw stone into structures that not only defied gravity, but also captured the imagination. It was a craft that demanded resilience, skill, and a touch of artistry, turning a mere rock into a narrative carved in stone. Even now, centuries later, these creations continue to inspire awe, standing as a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of beauty. But let's not sugarcoat it. The life of a stonemason was no fairy tale. It was a grind, a daily slog through dust and danger, with no guarantees beyond the next payday or lack thereof. Yet, it was this very struggle that forged their legacy. These masons were the backbone of medieval society, the silent architects behind the world's most enduring symbols of faith and power. Without them, the medieval skyline would be as flat as a peasant's wallet during tax season. And speaking of legacies, stonemasonry left an indelible mark, not just on the landscape, but on the cultural and social fabric of the time. The guilds, those medieval trade unions, laid the groundwork for modern labor rights and professional organizations. They weren't just building cathedrals, they were building a framework for the future of work, one that emphasized skill, craftsmanship, and the value of collective effort. In many ways, their legacy is still felt today, echoing through the corridors of modern architecture and labor movements. So, what do we take away from this tale of grit and grandeur? It's a reminder that behind every majestic monument is a story of human endeavor, a testament to the resilience and creativity that define our shared history. The stonemasons of medieval Europe weren't just builders. They were artists in their own right, crafting a legacy that would stand the test of time. Their work was a labor of love and survival, their legacy carved into the very stones they shaped. In the end, stonemasonry in the medieval era was about more than just constructing buildings. It was about constructing meaning, creating a narrative that bridged the earthly and the divine. It was a craft that demanded not just skill but heart, a relentless pursuit of beauty amidst the harsh realities of life. And as you gaze upon those ancient stones, remember that each chisel mark is a chapter in a story that continues to unfold, a tribute to those who dared to carve their dreams into the very fabric of history. You're standing in the control room of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and it's April 25, 1986. The place hums with the sound of machines you've long grown accustomed to, like the comforting whir of a fridge in a quiet kitchen. Only this fridge is a behemoth capable of powering millions of homes. You're one of the many diligent workers, ensuring the Soviet Union's ambitious energy goals are met. You're part of a grand vision to light up the empire with nuclear power, a supposedly clean and limitless resource. Now, let's talk about the RBMK reactor, the star of this show. Or is it the villain? It's a bit like a high-maintenance celebrity, brilliant, but with a dangerous side. The RBMK design was a Soviet innovation, a graphite-moderated nuclear reactor that promised to be the workhorse of the Soviet energy program. But here's the twist. While it was a marvel of engineering on paper, it was also a classic example of political compromise over technical prudence. It was designed to be dual-purpose, producing both power and plutonium for nuclear weapons. Yes, that's right. It was a 2-for-1 deal, which sounds efficient until you realize the safety trade-offs involved. You, as a Chernobyl worker, are probably not privy to every detail of the RBMK quirks. You know enough to do your job, but the reactor's potential for instability during low-power operations, that's not in your manual. But why would it be? After all, the official line is that Soviet technology is infallible, and questioning it could land you in hot water. So, like everyone else, you trust the system, because that's how things work around here. Let's introduce some key players in this nuclear opera. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, is a man with a reputation for being tough as nails. His approach to safety is more get it done than let's double-check that. But hey, efficiency is the name of the game in Soviet industry. Then there's Viktor Blukhanov, the plant director, who's got the unenviable job of balancing the demands of Moscow with the realities of running a nuclear power plant. Imagine trying to keep a dragon fed while ignoring the smell of smoke. Yeah, that's Brukhanov's daily grind. The Soviet Union in the mid-'80s was a place of contrasts. On one hand, there's the facade of unstoppable progress, with nuclear plants like Chernobyl at the forefront. On the other, there's the crumbling infrastructure and the constant shortages that plague everyday life. This is a nation that put the first man in space, yet can't guarantee fresh fruit in its stores. A world where the grandeur of Red Square is undercut by the shabby state of the apartment blocks that surround it. You and your fellow workers are cogs in this massive machine, part of a system that's supposed to be the future. Nuclear power is the pride of the Soviet Union, a symbol of its technological prowess. But beneath the surface, there are cracks, both literal and metaphorical. The RBMK reactors, like the one you work with, are cheaper to build than Western designs, but that savings comes at the cost of safety features. It's a bit like buying a car without airbags, because you got a great deal on the leather seats. But here's the kicker. No one's really talking about these issues openly. There's a culture of silence, where problems are whispered about but rarely addressed head-on. Perhaps you've heard the occasional grumble or rumor, but the official stance is that everything is under control. You're expected to do your job, keep your head down, and trust that those in charge know what they are doing. As the hours tick by on this April day, the plant is gearing up for a safety test. It's meant to simulate a power outage and see how long the turbines can keep generating power to circulate the coolant. Sounds straightforward, right? But there's a catch. The test has been delayed, pushing it into the night shift, a crew less experienced with these kinds of operations. It's like asking the B team to pitch in the World Series without a warm-up, but you roll with it because orders are orders. So here you are, part of an experiment in both energy and human endurance. The RBMK reactor, a marvel of Soviet engineering, stands ready to prove its worth. You're surrounded by concrete and steel, with the political ambitions of a superpower resting on your shoulders. It's a lot to take in, but you're just one worker among many, keeping this nuclear beast fed and running. Little do you know, beneath your feet, the seeds of an unprecedented disaster are being sown. The combination of human error, design flaws, and a relentless drive to meet quotas is a volatile mix. But for now, you go about your duties, unaware of the ticking time bomb that is the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The day seems like any other, but soon, history will take a turn that no one could have predicted. As the clock ticks closer to midnight on April 26, 1986, the atmosphere in the control room of Reactor 4 is a curious cocktail of routine and tension. You might feel like a cast member in a play where everyone knows their lines, but the script is about to take a wild detour into chaos. The safety test, originally scheduled for earlier, has now slipped into the hands of the night shift, a group lacking the experience of the daytime crew, but not their commitment to Soviet industrial dreams. The plan, to test how long the turbines can keep spinning after a simulated power loss. Simple on paper, but in practice, it was a bit like trying to land a plane with one wing tied behind your back. Now, let's talk about the RBMK reactor, a technical marvel with the stability of a Jenga tower during an earthquake. Sure, it was a powerhouse, but it had a penchant for instability at low power settings, a fact conveniently underplayed by those who figured that admitting flaws in Soviet technology was akin to treason. You see, the reactor was supposed to run at a steady 700 megawatts, but due to a series of mishaps and miscommunications, the power level dropped to a mere 30 megawatts. That's like revving a sports car, only to find it sputtering like a rusty old scooter. Enter Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer. His approach to problem-solving was less, let's be cautious, and more, let's roll the dice and see what happens. Dyatlov decided to push the power back up, a move akin to waking a sleeping dragon because you're bored. The problem, doing so created a dangerous buildup of xenon-135, a neutron-absorbing isotope within the reactor. Sounds complicated, right? Think of it as clogging your car's exhaust while stepping on the gas. Communication breakdowns during this period were as legendary as they were tragic. Instructions were misunderstood or ignored, with a chain of command more twisted than a Soviet bureaucracy. The operators, under immense pressure, had to dance around a minefield of conflicting orders. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with pieces from 3 different boxes. One can almost hear the ghost of Murphy's Law whispering in the background. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. With the reactor now unstable, the infamous AZ-5 button, intended as a last resort safety mechanism, was pressed. Instead of shutting things down safely, it exacerbated the situation. Why? Well, due to an oddity in the RBMK design, inserting the control rods caused a temporary increase in reactivity. Imagine hitting the brakes on your car, only for it to speed up instead. The result was a power surge that shot through the reactor like a bolt of lightning through a tin roof. Then came the explosion. Not a Hollywood-style fireball, but a deafening blast that tore through the reactor's core, sending chunks of radioactive material skyward. Debunking the myth here. It wasn't spontaneous combustion, but rather a tragic chain of human errors and design flaws. The reactor lid, weighing over 1,000 tons, was tossed like a frisbee. It was the kind of catastrophe only a Soviet engineer's worst nightmares could conjure. Chaos ensued, with the control room resembling a scene from a disaster movie. Confusion reigned supreme as operators, some in shock, others scrambling for answers, faced the harsh reality of a situation spiraling out of control. Communication lines were jammed, misinformation spread, and decisions were made in the kind of desperate haste that history books love to dissect. The aftermath was a communication disaster of epic proportions. Initial reports were muddled, downplaying the severity or outright denying the explosion had even occurred. It's like telling someone their kitchen's on fire while insisting it's just a breezy barbecue. The Soviet government, caught between the instinct to cover up and the need for swift action, leaned towards the former, further complicating an already dire situation. In the grand theater of human events, Chernobyl stands as a stark reminder of what happens when ambition steamrolls over caution, when systems designed to protect are compromised by the very people they are meant to serve. As the dust settled and the extent of the disaster began to unfold, the world outside Pripyat remained largely oblivious. But within the plant, and for miles around, the reality was grim. And so, here we are, in the midst of a night that would change history. The events of this fateful night would unravel over the coming days, as the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. But for now, we leave the story hanging in the balance. An ominous pause before the world wakes to the full magnitude of Chernobyl's legacy. As the dust settles on the chaos of that fateful night, let's take a moment to step outside the plant and into the corridors of Soviet power, where denial is the order of the day. An understatement is practically a state policy. The Soviet Union's initial response to Chernobyl was like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose while insisting the smoke was just morning mist. It was a classic case of the emperor's new clothes, only this time the emperor was a superpower, and the stakes were nuclear. At first, the Soviet leadership seemed to think they could sweep the fallout under the proverbial rug. Reports trickling up the chain of command were sanitized, and the true extent of the disaster was kept under wraps like a state secret. Initially, the explosion was downplayed, with officials describing it as merely a minor issue. But this wasn't a leaky faucet you could ignore. It was a nuclear reactor belching radiation like a dragon with a bad cold. Enter the liquidators, the unsung heroes of this harrowing tale. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, the Soviet government mobilized a small army of these workers to contain the disaster. Picture this: nearly 600 people, soldiers, firefighters, engineers, and everyday citizens, were drafted into what was, essentially, a kamikaze mission. Their task was to decontaminate the area, build a concrete sarcophagus over Reactor 4, and prevent further radioactive leakage. In short, they were the human shield against an invisible enemy. The liquidators worked in shifts, spending only limited time in the most dangerous zones to minimize radiation exposure. The irony: many of them were armed with little more than shovels, wheelbarrows, and a grim sense of duty. Protective gear was often inadequate, resembling something more suited to a rainstorm than a nuclear fallout. In fact, dosimeters, devices that measure radiation exposure, were in short supply. The ones they had often maxed out at levels that vastly underestimated the true danger. It was like trying to measure a tidal wave with a teacup. In the political arena, the Soviet Union was spinning the situation with all the finesse of a circus juggler with buttered hands. The narrative was controlled with the precision of a stage-managed opera. Initial public announcements were vague, downplaying the severity of the incident. The Kremlin's first official statement came 2 days after the explosion, and even then, it was a masterpiece of understatement. It read more like a weather report than an admission of a nuclear catastrophe. But the truth was harder to hide than a radioactive cloud. On April 28, Swedish scientists detected elevated radiation levels, prompting them to sound the alarm. The international community began to piece together the puzzle, and the Soviet Union's hand was forced. It was a public relations disaster to match the environmental one. The world watched as the USSR scrambled to contain not just the reactor, but the narrative itself. Meanwhile, in the ghostly shadows of Pripyat, life was anything but normal. The city, home to nearly 50,000 people, was evacuated 36 hours after the explosion, an exodus that was as surreal as it was haphazard. Residents were told to pack for a short stay, perhaps a few days, but the reality was far grimmer. They left behind homes, belongings, and a way of life, not knowing they would never return. It was a mass evacuation conducted with the efficiency of a high-speed train derailed on purpose. The first responders, the firefighters and plant workers who rushed to the scene, bore the brunt of the radiation. These brave souls faced an invisible enemy armed with little more than courage and a sense of duty. Many of them suffered acute radiation sickness, a grim testament to their sacrifice. It's a sobering thought. The very people tasked with saving lives were themselves unwitting victims of a system that prioritized secrecy over safety. In the days and weeks that followed, as the full scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore, there was a palpable shift in the Soviet Union. The initial response, steeped in denial and obfuscation, slowly gave way to a reluctant admission of the truth. The liquidators continued their work, building the concrete sarcophagus that would entomb Reactor 4 and hopefully contain the radioactive threat. It was a race against time, with human lives and the environment hanging in the balance. Economically, the disaster was a black hole for the Soviet Union. The cost of the cleanup effort was astronomical, estimated at 18 billion rubles, an amount that strained an already creaking economy. It was as if someone had handed a bill for a luxury yacht to a nation struggling to keep the lights on. But Chernobyl wasn't just an economic burden. It was a seismic shift in the way the world viewed nuclear power and the Soviet regime. The Soviet leadership, under Mikhail Gorbachev, faced one of its greatest challenges. Chernobyl exposed the cracks in the facade of Soviet infallibility, highlighting the systemic issues that plagued the Union. It was a turning point, a catalyst that accelerated the reforms of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. The disaster forced a nation to confront its vulnerabilities, to question the very systems that had once seemed unassailable. In the broader context, Chernobyl was a wake-up call, not just for the Soviet Union, but for the world. It underscored the dangers of nuclear power when mismanaged, and the catastrophic potential of human error compounded by flawed design. It was a stark reminder that in the nuclear age, the margin for error is razor-thin, and the consequences of failure can be devastating. As we pause to consider the immediate aftermath of Chernobyl, we're left with a landscape forever altered by human hubris and technological ambition. The liquidators, the unsung heroes of this saga, faced unimaginable challenges with courage and resolve. Their efforts were a testament to the human spirit, even as they were caught in the crossfire of political machinations and a looming ecological disaster. The story of Chernobyl is far from over. In the coming chapters, we'll delve deeper into the long-term effects of the disaster, the lessons learned, and the ongoing challenges that still ripple through the fabric of history. The reactor may be silent, but its legacy is anything but. As we emerge from the immediate chaos of Chernobyl's aftermath, the world starts to wake up to the radioactive hangover that spread across Europe faster than a viral meme. If you thought the Soviet Union could keep a lid on this, well, surprise. The fallout didn't just stay in Ukraine's backyard. It took a European tour, leaving a trail of confusion and Geiger counter spikes in its wake. It didn't take long for the rest of the world to catch a whiff of something not quite right, like catching your neighbor's barbecue smoke when you know they don't have a grill. Sweden's Forsmark nuclear power plant, about 100 kilometers away, picked up elevated radiation levels on April 28, which was their first hint that something was rotten in the state of Soviet affairs. The Swedes, not ones for sitting idly by while their daisies start glowing, asked the Soviets, "What's going on over there?" The response was akin to a teenager trying to explain away a broken window, vague, elusive, but ultimately unconvincing. This was a time when the Iron Curtain was supposed to block everything from Western eyes, but Chernobyl proved that radiation respects no borders. The Soviet Union's initial reluctance to spill the beans on Chernobyl could have been a comedy of errors if it weren't so tragic. Their delayed admission of a nuclear accident was like finally admitting you crashed the family car after your neighbors already saw the wreckage being towed away. Once the news broke, the world watched with a mix of horror, disbelief, and a dash of "I told you so" from nuclear critics. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, was suddenly busier than a one-legged man in a butt-kicking contest, fielding calls and trying to make sense of the data, or lack thereof, coming out of the USSR. Western nations had been skeptical of Soviet nuclear safety standards for years, and Chernobyl was the unfortunate vindication they never wanted to be right about. The public reaction was a cocktail of fear and fascination. In the United States and Europe, protests against nuclear power gained momentum, fueled by the nightmarish images and stories trickling out of Chernobyl. It was as if a horror movie had jumped off the screen and started haunting people's dreams. In Italy, a referendum in 1987 led to the phasing out of nuclear power altogether. Germany, too, began re-evaluating its nuclear policies, and anti-nuclear sentiment surged across the continent, a chain reaction of public opinion triggered by the fallout. Meanwhile, back in the Soviet Union, the evacuation of Pripyat was a scene straight out of a dystopian novel. Picture nearly 50,000 people being evacuated on April 27, a full day after the explosion, with promises that they'd be back in a few days. The reality, a permanent goodbye to homes and a rushed farewell to an old life left behind under the shadow of Reactor 4. Imagine leaving your apartment, thinking you'll be back for dinner, only to find out you're never setting foot in your home again. Economically, Chernobyl was a financial black hole for the Soviet Union. The cleanup cost soared to an astronomical 18 billion rubles. Adjusted for inflation, that's like setting fire to a pile of cash the size of a small country. The economic impact rippled across the USSR, already teetering on the brink of financial collapse. It was as if the Soviet economy was a sinking ship, and Chernobyl punched another hole in the hull. Politically, the disaster was a ticking time bomb for Mikhail Gorbachev's administration. The initial cover-up attempts were a PR disaster, and Gorbachev had to navigate the fallout both literally and metaphorically. The incident exposed the systemic rot within the Soviet bureaucracy and became a catalyst for the reforms of glasnost and perestroika. Gorbachev later admitted that Chernobyl, more than any other event, was a key factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a nuclear wake-up call that even the most powerful propaganda couldn't muffle. As Chernobyl's radioactive cloud spread across Europe, it carried with it a sobering message about the dangers of nuclear power and the fallibility of human systems. The disaster prompted a global re-evaluation of nuclear safety, leading to stricter regulations and oversight. The IAEA called for comprehensive safety reviews and improvements in international communication, a bid to ensure that no future nuclear incident will be shrouded in silence. Yet, amid the chaos, there were moments of humanity and resilience. The liquidators, those unsung heroes who faced the invisible enemy armed with little more than courage and a sense of duty, showcased the best of human spirit in the worst of circumstances. They may not have had capes, but their bravery was nothing short of heroic. Their efforts, though often overshadowed by the larger narrative, were crucial in containing the disaster and mitigating further damage. Chernobyl's legacy is a complex tapestry of tragedy, heroism, and hard lessons learned. It reshaped the global conversation on nuclear power and left an indelible mark on history. The disaster was a stark reminder that with great power comes great responsibility, a lesson that transcends borders and political ideologies. As we continue to unravel the story of Chernobyl, the lessons it taught us remain as relevant today as they were in 1986. The reactor may be silent, but its echoes continue to reverberate through time, challenging us to reflect on the balance between progress and safety, ambition and humility. The story is far from over, and its final chapters are still being written in the annals of history, waiting for us to turn the page. As we turn the page on Chernobyl's opening chapters, we dive into the murky waters of its long-term legacy, a saga that's as enduring as it is haunting. It's easy to look back and see Chernobyl as one of those never-again moments, like wearing neon leg warmers or trusting a diet based entirely on cabbage soup. But unlike those missteps, Chernobyl's impact isn't something you can just brush off with a chuckle. Let's start with the environment, which bore the brunt of this nuclear hiccup. The term Chernobyl now conjures images of a desolate, post-apocalyptic landscape where nature has turned into a bizarre science experiment. The exclusion zone, a 30-kilometer radius of note, became an unintended wildlife sanctuary. Ironically, in the absence of humans, nature started to reclaim its territory. Wolves, boars, and even the mighty European bison strutted back in, as if saying, "You humans made a mess, but we're here to clean it up in our own peculiar way." While it sounds like a scene from an eco-friendly fantasy novel, the reality is more complex. Yes, wildlife flourished, but radiation hotspots still remain, silently impacting the ecosystem in ways we are still trying to understand. Now, onto the human toll, always a grim tally in accidents like these. The immediate death toll from the explosion was 31, but the slow creep of radiation-related illnesses is where the numbers get fuzzy. Estimates of related cancer deaths range from 4,000 to upwards of 90,000, depending on whom you ask. It's like trying to count jelly beans in a jar. Only the jelly beans are invisible and occasionally lethal. The psychological impact, that's a whole other kettle of fish. The trauma of displacement, the stigma of radiation exposure, and the anxiety of living in the shadow of a nuclear disaster have left scars as deep as any physical ailment. Speaking of myths, let's tackle a few that have grown legs and wandered off into the urban legend territory. First up, the glowing Chernobyl animals. Despite popular lore, no, the wildlife isn't bioluminescent like some radioactive Disney parade. The reality is subtler, with genetic mutations and reduced populations in certain species. But hey, the idea of glow-in-the-dark deer is certainly more cinematic, right? Another myth. The Chernobyl plant workers were reckless cowboys playing fast and loose with nuclear tech. In truth, many were well-trained professionals caught in a web of systemic failures and bad luck. The disaster wasn't the result of a cavalier attitude, but of a flawed design and the relentless pressure of Soviet industrial expectations. It's a reminder that sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time means more than any personal failings. Economically, the disaster was a financial sinkhole. With cleanup costs ballooning to billions, the Soviet Union found itself financially gasping for air. Chernobyl wasn't just a blip on the economic radar. It was a tsunami that contributed to the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union. It's a stark lesson in how one catastrophic event can tip the scales of an entire regime teetering on the brink. On the policy side, Chernobyl forced the world to hit pause and rethink nuclear energy. It was like the universe was holding a neon sign saying, "Proceed with caution." In the wake of the disaster, countries around the globe tightened safety standards and re-evaluated their nuclear programs. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, introduced new protocols, and nuclear plants worldwide underwent rigorous safety checks. It was a global wake-up call that reverberated through boardrooms and government halls. And now, the human spirit, a topic that defies neat conclusions and tidy summaries. Chernobyl is a testament to resilience, both in the face of disaster and in its aftermath. The liquidators, those brave souls who charged headlong into danger armed with little more than determination, are emblematic of this. Their courage, though often overshadowed by the magnitude of the disaster, is a glowing reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can shine brightly. As we wrap up this chapter, we are left with a sense of cautious optimism. Chernobyl was a tragedy of epic proportions, yet it also sparked a global conversation about safety, accountability, and the delicate dance between progress and preservation. It taught us that technology, while powerful, is not infallible, and that human systems, no matter how robust, are susceptible to the frailties of human nature. Today, as the world grapples with new challenges and old debates about nuclear energy, the lessons of Chernobyl remain as relevant as ever. It's a reminder that history, while often messy and complex, offers us invaluable wisdom, that the ghosts of past mistakes can guide us toward a more informed and cautious future. The story of Chernobyl is not just about a reactor blowing its top. It's about the ripple effects across time and space, the profound impact on human lives, and the enduring questions it poses. It's a tale of caution and resilience, of human error and triumph. And as we continue to turn these pages, we carry with us the hope that out of the ashes of disaster, we can build a future that honors the lessons of the past. The sun rises over Rome, casting its golden light on a city that never truly sleeps. And there it is, the Colosseum, like a massive stone giant smack in the middle of the bustling metropolis. If you're a Roman citizen, or at least pretending to be one for now, this is your playground, your escape, and your social media all rolled into one. You're not just here for a quick distraction. This is the heart of public life, where politics, entertainment, and really questionable ethics mix like a scandalous cocktail. Now, let's talk logistics. You've heard about these games, right? Gladiators, wild animals, and the occasional naval battle when they decide to flood the whole place for kicks. But how do you get a seat in this ancient amphitheater that could accommodate around 50,000 spectators? The magic number you need is surprisingly easy to remember. 0. That's right. For the average Roman Joe, or should I say Gaius, the cost to get into one of these spectacles is zilch. The emperor foots the bill, usually to keep the masses entertained and less likely to revolt. It's like ancient bread and circuses, minus the bread, though sometimes they throw in free food, so maybe not so different after all. But don't think you can just waltz in and pick any seat you fancy. Social hierarchy rules here, and you've got to know your place. The best seats closest to the action are reserved for senators and the elite. If you're in that tier, congrats, you've got ancient VIP status. But if you're not, well, grab your toga and get ready to climb. The higher up you go in the stands, the less prestigious your social standing. It's like a brutal game of musical chairs, where the music's been replaced by the sound of swords clashing and lions roaring. And let's not forget about timing. Arriving early is not just advised, it's essential. Otherwise, you're stuck squinting from the nosebleeds or, worse, missing the action entirely. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of lining up for an iPhone release, but with more potential for blood spatter. You see, showing up late isn't just poor form, it's a tactical error in social survival. You want to be seen, and maybe catch the eye of someone important, or at least someone who can get you a better seat next time. Now, before you get too swept up in the romanticized idea of gladiators as rock stars of the ancient world, let's set the record straight. Sure, some Romans loved the games with the zeal of a modern-day sports fan, but not everyone was a fanboy of the bloodshed. Philosophers and Stoics had their criticisms, thinking the whole thing was a bit barbaric. Even the poet Juvenal, who coined the phrase bread and circuses, wasn't exactly praising the moral fiber of his fellow citizens. Think of this as reality TV, but with a much higher body count. The games were political theater and social commentary wrapped in a very real fight for survival. So there you have it. The Colosseum isn't just an ancient relic. It's a living, breathing embodiment of Rome's social order, political machinations, and a rather intense taste for entertainment. It's a place where life and death are just a spear's throw away, and where your position in the stands speaks volumes about your place in society. Ready to dive deeper? Let's move on to the next chapter of this gritty Roman adventure. Speaking of that spear's throw away from life and death, let's pivot from the pulse of Roman society to the literal beating heart of it all, the Colosseum itself. This wasn't just any old structure. It was the architectural superstar of its time, a genuine wonder of engineering. No one does grandiosity quite like the Romans, and when they decided to build a stadium, they went big. The Colosseum could hold around 50,000 spectators. Think of it as Rome's version of the Super Bowl, just with more gladiators and lions, fewer halftime shows. But how did they pull off such an impressive feat with second-century technology? Well, the Romans didn't just dabble in architecture. They were the heavyweights. The Colosseum stands as a testament to their engineering prowess. It featured an innovative system of vaults and arches that distributed the weight so effectively it could support the massive stone structure we still marvel at today. This wasn't just a pile of rocks. It was a carefully crafted masterpiece. Forget your modern stadiums with their comfy seats and LED screens. This baby had corridors, trapdoors, and even elevators. And let's not ignore the velarium, the ancient retractable awning that could be extended to protect the spectators from the sun. We're talking about a massive piece of canvas that could be maneuvered by a team of sailors. Now, this was a time when sunscreen wasn't even a glimmer in anyone's eye, so this shaded relief was a game changer. Imagine trying to rig that up without modern cranes or a YouTube tutorial. It was essentially the world's largest parasol, and it required some serious manpower to operate. It's a small wonder the whole setup didn't just float away like a giant Roman kite. The Colosseum wasn't just about seating capacity and sun protection, though. It was the original multi-purpose venue. Besides gladiatorial games, it hosted animal hunts, executions, and even mock sea battles. Yes, they flooded the arena for that. Picture the logistics. Water pumped in from nearby aqueducts, all for the thrill of watching ships clash in a miniaturized ocean. It was Rome's version of setting up a slip-end slide, but with boats and a lot more drama. Now, onto the part of the Colosseum experience that might not have made it into the travel brochures, the concessions. You think modern stadium snacks are pricey? Try dealing with a Roman hawker. The food options back then had their own peculiar charm. Forget hot dogs and beers. You were more likely to get olives, figs, or bread. If you were really splurging, maybe some sausages or meat on a stick, but don't expect a gourmet experience. The real challenge was getting to the concession stand in the first place. Imagine navigating a sea of togas just to grab a snack. Good luck with that. Then there were the restrooms. The less glamorous side of ancient entertainment. You couldn't just dash off to a clean, private stall and freshen up. No, the facilities were more communal. Picture stone benches with strategically placed holes. Let's just say personal space wasn't a big concern. And hand sanitizer. You'd be lucky to find a communal sponge on a stick, reused by countless others. Talk about a breeding ground for germs that would make any modern germaphobe faint. Yes, the Colosseum was a marvel, but it was also a microcosm of Roman ingenuity and the gritty realities of public life. It was where the grandeur of Rome met the messiness of humanity. As we pull the curtain back on this ancient spectacle, it's clear that the Colosseum was more than just a venue. It was the beating heart of Roman culture, with all its splendor and warts. But wait, there's more. Our journey through the Colosseum and the life of a Roman citizen is just beginning. Stay tuned as we explore further into this captivating world, where every stone tells a story, and every echo is a whisper from the past. As you settle into your seat, ready for the spectacle to unfold, let's dive into the gritty world of the Colosseum's main event, the gladiatorial games. Forget Hollywood's heroic portrayals of these fighters as the ancient world's rock stars. The reality is a bit less glamorous and a lot more complex. Gladiators weren't just brawny warriors looking for glory. They were a motley crew of slaves, criminals, and occasionally volunteers drawn by the siren call of fame and fortune. Picture a lineup that'd make any talent scouts scratch their head. Now why, you might ask, would anyone risk life and limb for the chance to play in this violent theater? Well, for many, it wasn't a choice. Slaves and criminals were often forced into the arena as punishment, their fates tied to the whims of the crowd. Yet the allure of a gladiator's life wasn't all doom and gloom. Successful fighters could earn their freedom, fame, and even wealth. The gladiator Spartacus, for instance, didn't just fight. He led a significant slave uprising that shook the Roman Empire to its core. Talk about turning the tables. But let's not romanticize this too much. Being a gladiator was a risky gig with a high turnover rate. And by turnover, I mean the kind involving swords and an unfortunate amount of bloodshed. Yet the promise of freedom and the chance to be a hero did add a tantalizing layer to the brutal reality. Some even became the ancient equivalent of sports celebrities, with fans, endorsements, and the occasional piece of graffiti celebrating their exploits. Imagine seeing your name scrawled on a wall, Secundus, the heartthrob of the arena. It wasn't all bad for those who managed to survive. Speaking of graffiti, let's pause to appreciate the ancient equivalent of social media. Roman citizens loved to leave their mark, and the walls of Pompeii, among other places, are littered with inscriptions singing the praises or lamenting the losses of their favorite gladiators. These writings give us a window into the psyche of the Roman public, who saw these fighters as both entertainment and a reflection of the Empire's might. It's like ancient Yelp reviews, minus the stars, and with a bit more bloodlust. Now, let's cast our gaze to the imperial barks, where the Emperor sat, not just as a spectator, but as the puppet master of this bloody ballet. Emperors understood the political power of the games. They were more than just a diversion, they were a tool for control. By sponsoring lavish spectacles, emperors like Augustus and Trajan could curry favor with the public, distract them from political issues, and reinforce their own divine status. Bread and circuses, remember. The games were a way to keep the populace entertained and, crucially, compliant. The emperors knew that a satisfied citizenry was less likely to revolt. During the reign of Emperor Titus, for example, the games were used to celebrate the opening of the Colosseum, lasting 100 days, and reportedly resulting in 9,000 animals being killed. It was a spectacle of excess, designed to showcase the emperor's generosity and the might of Rome. Of course, this was also a time when the Roman Empire stretched across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia, so the stakes were as high as the empire was vast. Yet, not everyone was on board with these blood-soaked festivities. The games were criticized by some contemporary thinkers who thought they were a sign of Rome's moral decay. Philosophers like Seneca and Cicero condemned the games as barbaric, arguing that they debased both the participants and the spectators. It's as if they saw the Colosseum as a mirror reflecting a society that had lost its moral compass. But let's not kid ourselves. Those voices were often drowned out by the roar of the crowd, hungry for the next bout. As the gladiators prepared to enter the arena, they would salute the emperor with the famous phrase, Ave, Imperator, mortuary te salutant. Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. It was a chilling reminder of the stakes at play, a nod to the theater of life and death that was about to unfold. The games were a test of skill, strength, and sheer survival instinct, with the crowd's favor sometimes determining a gladiator's fate. Thumbs up, and you live to fight another day. Thumbs down, and well, you get the picture. The gladiatorial games were more than just entertainment. They were a reflection of the Roman ethos, a society that thrived on conquest, spectacle, and a peculiar mix of brutality and civilization. The Colosseum, in all its grandeur and gore, was the heartbeat of Rome, a place where emperors flexed their political muscles, gladiators fought for their lives, and sometimes won their freedom, and citizens gathered to witness the drama unfold. It was a world where the lines between life and death, freedom and slavery, were as thin as a gladiator's sword edge. So, as you soak in the atmosphere, remember that the Colosseum wasn't just an arena. It was a stage where the complexities of Roman life played out in vivid, often bloody detail. But wait, there's more to explore. Our journey through this fascinating slice of history doesn't end here. We've still got political schemes, societal shifts, and more to uncover in our next chapter. Stay tuned as we continue to peel back the layers of this ancient wonder. So, just as you're soaking in the ambience of the Colosseum and pondering the life and death stakes hanging over the arena like a particularly grim cloud, let's pivot to the financial gymnastics behind this colossal showbiz operation. Yes, it's time to talk cash, because nothing screams Roman spectacle quite like the sound of coins clinking. The Colosseum wasn't just a political stage, it was an economic powerhouse, and the price tag for these events was as staggering as the body count. Hosting games at the Colosseum was the ancient equivalent of throwing the world's most extravagant party, and footing the bill would give even the wealthiest Roman a serious case of wallet palpitations. We're talking about costs that could run into the millions of sesterces. For context, a single sestus might buy you a loaf of bread or a mug of wine. Now imagine spending millions on a few days of entertainment. Even for the emperors, it was akin to setting a pile of money on fire and then inviting the whole city to watch it burn. But why splash out on such an exorbitant spectacle? Simple, political strategy. These games were a public service with a twist, a way for emperors to flex their magnanimity muscles and keep the populace in their good graces. Think of it as ancient PR, minus the press releases and social media influencers. Instead, you had gladiators and lions doing the heavy lifting. The people got entertained, and the emperor got a boost in popularity. Everyone wins, except, the participants in the arena. Behind this grand display, a veritable army of workers toiled away, each cog in the machine ensuring that the spectacle went off without a hitch. You had animal handlers ensuring that the beasts were ready to make their dramatic entrance, along with the architects who designed elaborate set pieces that could transform the arena into a mythical landscape. These set designers were the unsung heroes of the Colosseum, crafting worlds that would make even the most jaded Roman gasp in awe. They created everything from lush forests to towering fortresses, all staged within the confines of the arena. Forget CGI. This was practical effects at their finest. Of course, not every behind-the-scenes role was as glamorous. Enslaved people and condemned criminals filled the ranks of those who made the gears turn. They did the grunt work, from moving heavy set pieces to cleaning up after the carnage, a thankless task in a world where life often had a disturbingly low price tag. While the games might have symbolized Rome's power and extravagance, they also laid bare the harsh realities of a society built on the backs of the exploited. And let's not forget about the animals. Thousands were brought in from across the empire, from elephants to exotic big cats, creating a veritable menagerie of doom. The logistics of moving these creatures were mind-boggling, involving a network of traders, handlers, and more than a few daring captures. It was a dangerous business, but the Romans had an insatiable appetite for the exotic, and the presence of wild animals added a thrilling unpredictability to the games. Yet, beneath the spectacle of roaring lions and clashing swords lay a darker truth. The Colosseum was a stage for human suffering as much as it was a theater of entertainment. Enslaved individuals and condemned criminals often found themselves thrust into the arena, forced to fight for their lives. While some might dream of a miraculous victory leading to freedom, for most, the reality was far bleaker. The games were a grim reminder of the precarious balance between life and death, freedom and servitude. These spectacles served as a harsh reflection of the societal order, where the whims of the elite dictated the fate of those below. It was a system that thrived on inequality, where the disenfranchised bore the brunt of the empire's thirst for entertainment. The games were a microcosm of Rome itself, a place where power dynamics were on full display, wrapped in the guise of a public service. So, as you mull over the layers of complexity that define the Colosseum, remember that this iconic structure was more than an architectural feat. It was a living testament to the paradoxes of Roman society, a place where glory and depravity, spectacle and suffering coexisted side by side. And the story doesn't end here. We've still got more layers to peel back, more tales to tell, as we continue to unravel the intricate fabric of this ancient world. Stay tuned for the next chapter in our journey through time and spectacle. As we peel back the layers of time and drama that define the Colosseum, the sun begins to set on our ancient amphitheater. But don't worry, this isn't a melancholy goodbye. It's a chance to reflect on how this stone giant's roar got gradually quieter, eventually fading into the annals of history. So, what happened? Why did the cheers die down and the games come to an end? Well, let's just say the Colosseum fell victim to a perfect storm of shifting societal winds and religious rebranding. First up, the public's appetite for blood started to wane. By the 4th century AD, Rome was going through a bit of an identity crisis. The empire was sprawling, and with it came an influx of diverse cultures and ideas. The once unquestioned love for gladiatorial games began to crack under the weight of new philosophies and ethics. Enter Christianity, a relatively new religion on the block that wasn't exactly thrilled about the whole let's watch people and animals fight to the death thing. From the get-go, Christians called out the games as inhumane and contrary to their teachings. By the time Emperor Constantine the Great rolled around in the early 300 with his edict of tolerance for Christianity, the religion's influence was growing like wildfire. Constantine himself wasn't shy about letting the world know his newfound faith wasn't down with such bloody pastimes. But don't go thinking the games just stopped overnight. Old habits die hard, especially when they are as entrenched as gladiatorial combat. Yet, by the time Emperor Honorius officially banned gladiator games in 404 AD, the writing was on the wall, quite possibly literally, given the penchant for graffiti. The combination of economic difficulties, changing tastes, and a growing Christian influence meant the Colosseum's days as a death arena were numbered. Speaking of the economy, let's not gloss over the financial aspect. Rome wasn't exactly swimming in sesterces by this point. The empire was split, under attack from various barbarian tribes, and the funds required to stage games were drying up faster than a Roman's wine stash at a Bacchus festival. The emperors had bigger fish to fry than hosting costly spectacles, and with cash flow taking a nosedive, the Colosseum slowly became less of a priority. Now, let's add a bit of irony to the tale. The very structure that had been the stage for so much death and drama began to suffer from neglect and decay. By the Middle Ages, the Colosseum was more ruin than wonder. It was repurposed, as many ancient buildings were, into a variety of roles: a fortress, a quarry, even a shrine at one point. People literally started carting off its stones to build other things, like churches and palaces. Talk about recycling. Despite its decline, the Colosseum never lost its grip on the imagination. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and this crumbling monument of Rome's imperial past became an icon of classical antiquity. It captured the hearts of artists, writers, and tourists who were enchanted by its grandeur and history. It wasn't just a ruin, it was a symbol, a testament to human ambition, both noble and brutal. And here's the kicker: the Colosseum has outlasted the empire that built it. Today, it stands as one of the most visited landmarks in the world, drawing millions who come to marvel at its ancient stones and ponder the lives of those who once filled its seats. It's a paradox, a relic of Roman excess and cruelty that has become a beacon of cultural heritage and human achievement. So, what do we really take away from this story? The Colosseum is a reminder of the dual nature of humanity, our capacity for both greatness and folly. It's the ultimate historical stage, where the lines between spectacle and reality blur, telling tales of courage, cruelty, and change. In its silence, it whispers the lessons of the past, urging us to reflect on what we choose to celebrate and remember. As the last rays of the sun slip away and the Colosseum stands quietly in the Roman night, we're left with a profound understanding of its legacy. It's more than a ruin. It's a mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature and the ebb and flow of history. So next time you gaze upon its ancient arches, remember that you're not just looking at stones. You're peering into the past, where every crack and crevice holds a story waiting to be told. Napoleon Bonaparte entered the world not with a bang, but with the gentle rustle of Corsican palm trees and the grumbles of Genoese landlords. Born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, Napoleon was the second of 8 children to Carlo and Letizia Bonaparte. Now, Corsica wasn't exactly the epicenter of European power back then. It was more like the rebellious teenager of the Mediterranean, having just been sold off to France by the Genoese, who decided they had better things to do than manage a bunch of unruly islanders. So, you can almost hear baby Napoleon's proverbial eye roll as he was born into a world of political upheaval. Young Napoleon, or Napoleon de Bonaparte, as he was originally known, because why not add a few extra vowels when you're Italian? Grew up in a house that was more rustic charm than luxurious estate. Bonapartes were minor nobility, which sounds fancy until you realize that minor nobility in Corsica was about as influential as being the mayor of a small fictional island. Still, they had enough clout to send young Napoleon to mainland France for schooling, and so began his journey from sun-drenched Mediterranean shores to the chilly, competitive halls of the Brienne-le-Chateau Military Academy. Now, imagine dropping a Corsican kid into a French military academy. It's a bit like sending a Texan to a New York prep school, lots of accents, lots of attitude, and a whole ton of cultural clashing. Napoleon, however, was nothing if not adaptive. He quickly learned French, though his accent was about as thick as a baguette. And despite his peers dubbing him the little corporal later in life, Napoleon wasn't actually short by the standards of his time. At 5'6", or 5'7", depending on who you ask, he was about average height for an 18th century Frenchman. It's just that everyone around him was, quite literally, a giant in the historical narrative. Fast forward to 1785, and Napoleon was graduating from the École Militaire in Paris, having completed the 2-year course in just one. Talk about being an overachiever. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment, a position that promised a steady income, but not much in the way of excitement. That changed when the French Revolution exploded onto the scene in 1789, a time when heads rolled, quite literally. and opportunities abounded for those ready to seize them. Amidst the chaos of revolutionary France, Napoleon's star began to rise. He was one of those rare individuals who could see the silver lining in the chaos of political upheaval. As the old regime crumbled and the new order stumbled its way into existence, Napoleon's military prowess caught the eye of the revolutionary government. By 1793, he had played a pivotal role in recapturing the city of Toulon from British forces, and at the ripe age of 24, he was promoted to brigadier general. It's like being made CEO before you can even legally rent a car. But let's not pretend it was all smooth sailing. France at the time was like a pressure cooker without a lid, and Napoleon had to navigate a labyrinth of political intrigue, backstabbing, and the occasional guillotine-happy revolutionary. He was also dealing with a France that was economically on the rocks. Bread riots were more common than good wine, and the treasury was emptier than a philosopher's wine glass after a particularly long debate. By the late 1790, Napoleon was not just a military genius, he was a political force too. France was in desperate need of stability, and Napoleon offered just that, wrapped in a shiny package of military exploits and nationalist fervor. In 1799, he staged a coup d'etat, overthrowing the Directory and establishing the consulate, with himself as first consul. It was a classic "you can't fire me because I quit" moment, except instead of quitting, he took over the entire company. Now, we can't ignore the myth of the little corporal. Napoleon's height, or the perceived lack of it, has been the butt of jokes for centuries. The British, ever the masters of propaganda, loved to paint him as a diminutive tyrant, and the legend stuck. But in reality, Napoleon's stature was more about the towering shadow he cast across Europe than the actual inches he stood above the ground. The social and economic conditions in France were ripe for someone like Napoleon to leapfrog his way up the ladder of power. The country was a hot mess. The rich had been dethroned, the poor were still poor, and everyone else was just trying to make it through without losing their head. The revolution had torn down a lot of barriers, and in the ensuing chaos, meritocracy had its moment in the sun. Napoleon, with his military acumen and political savvy, was exactly what France needed and feared in equal measure. Corsican by birth, French by necessity, Napoleon was a man who understood the power of reinvention. He was a master at turning the tides of fortune to his advantage, whether that meant switching allegiances, adapting tactics on the battlefield, or charming the right political allies. As we close this chapter on Napoleon's early years, it's clear that his story is one of transformation, ambition, and a relentless pursuit of greatness, no matter the odds or the height jokes. Stay tuned, because the saga of Napoleon Bonaparte is just getting started, and trust me, it's a tale that stands tall in the annals of history. As we segue from Napoleon's early rise to power, let's put a spotlight on the stage where he truly dazzled Europe, the battlefield. It's time to chat about how a Corsican with a chip on his shoulder and a flair for drama became the poster child for military brilliance, or at least how he spun it that way. First up, the Italian campaign of 1796-1797, where Napoleon practically wrote the book on how to win friends and influence armies. Napoleon's Italian campaign was the military equivalent of a rock tour. He commanded the French army of Italy, a ragtag group that was more rag than tag by all accounts. Undersupplied and underfed, they were the kind of army you'd hesitate to bet on in a bar fight, let alone against the Austrian and Piedmont Sardinian forces. But Napoleon, never one to let a little thing like reality get in the way, turned this scrappy underdog image into a rallying cry. He famously declared, "Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. Your patience, your courage do you honor, but give you neither worldly goods nor glory." And just like that, he flipped the script, motivating his troops with promises of glory and plunder. Napoleon's strategy was all about speed and surprise. His troops moved like a well-oiled, albeit rusty, machine, covering 80 miles in less than a week. A logistical feat that would make even the most hardened marathon runners wince. He outmaneuvered his opponents with daring flanking maneuvers and a relentless pace, proving that sometimes the best offense is a good offense. In battles like Montagnard and Lodi, Napoleon's forces, though often outnumbered, managed to decimate larger Austrian armies, capturing 160 6,000 prisoners and 2,000 cannons over the course of the campaign. It was like watching a chess master play against someone who thought they were playing checkers. And let's not forget the PR magic. Napoleon was as much a master of propaganda as he was of military tactics. Each victory was not just a military success, but a marketing triumph. He knew the power of narrative, painting himself as the heroic liberator driving the Austrians out of Italy. This wasn't just war, it was a brand-building exercise. He even had his own version of Instagram, in the form of bulletins sent back to France that exaggerated his successes and downplayed any setbacks. He was crafting his legend one victory at a time, a masterclass in spin long before social media influencers came along. But hold on, the Italian campaign wasn't just about battlefield glory. There was a hefty price tag attached to it. War is expensive, and Napoleon's campaigns were no exception. He financed his wars through the spoil system. Essentially, his troops were paid with whatever they could loot. This method not only kept the French treasury from bleeding dry, but also kept his soldiers motivated. However, this strategy was a double-edged sword. It meant that while Napoleon was winning hearts and minds in France, he was making plenty of enemies abroad. The Italians he liberated often found themselves liberated from their possessions, too. Next on Napoleon's itinerary was the Egyptian expedition of 1798, a campaign that was part conquest, part cultural road trip, and all kinds of ambitious. You see, Napoleon had a bit of a fascination with the East. He envisioned himself as a modern-day Alexander the Great, and Egypt was the stepping stone to India, the jewel in the crown of British colonialism. But let's be real. This was less about strategic necessity and more about Napoleon's ego needing a new continent to conquer. The Egyptian expedition was a logistical nightmare wrapped in a sandstorm. It started with a fleet of 400 ships carrying 36,000 soldiers and a host of scholars. Yes, scholars. Because Napoleon was not just waging war, he was exporting French culture. He brought along scientists, artists, and intellectuals to study and document the wonders of Egypt. This led to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which unlocked the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphs, a small victory amid a campaign that was more fizzle than sizzle. The Battle of the Pyramids in July 1798 was a textbook Napoleon victory. Facing the Mamluks, Napoleon used his trademark tactic of forming his troops into squares, a formation that was as impenetrable as it was intimidating. The French soldiers, armed with muskets, faced off against the Mamluks, who still fought on horseback with swords and spears. It was a slaughter, with the French losing only 29 men compared to the 6,000 Mamluks. Napoleon declared, "Soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." Talk about a soundbite. However, for all his initial success, the Egyptian campaign quickly turned into a hot mess, literally and figuratively. The British, not keen on Napoleon's Mediterranean holiday, sent Admiral Horatio Nelson to ruin the party. At the Battle of the Nile, Nelson's fleet decimated the French navy, stranding Napoleon and his army in Egypt. It was like being left at the altar, only with more cannonballs and less romance. Yet Napoleon, ever the spin doctor, managed to portray his Egyptian misadventures as part of a grand plan. He even compared his situation to Hannibal crossing the Alps, because why not aim high when rationalizing a defeat? Back in France, he was still hailed as a hero, proof that with the right narrative, even a disastrous campaign can be a moral victory. And let's talk logistics, shall we? Napoleon's campaigns were logistical marvels, but not without their hiccups. Supplying an army on the move was no small feat. In Italy, the terrain was rough, and supply lines were stretched thinner than a Parisian crepe. In Egypt, the searing heat and unfamiliar environment took a toll. The problems were compounded by disease. Dysentery and plague were as fearsome as any opposing army. Yet, Napoleon's ability to keep his army moving and relatively well supplied was part of what made his campaigns succeed where others might have faltered. Of course, it helped that he was often fighting against coalitions whose coordination was about as effective as a cat-herding convention. But let's not get carried away with the genius narrative. Napoleon's brilliance was often matched by his blunders. The Egyptian campaign, for all its initial success, was strategically questionable. It was a detour that ultimately achieved little in terms of weakening Britain. his real enemy. His relentless ambition sometimes led to overstretched supply lines and campaigns that were as unsustainable as they were audacious. So, was Napoleon a military genius, or just a lucky opportunist with a knack for storytelling? The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. He was undoubtedly brilliant, his tactics often ahead of their time. But his legend owes as much to his ability to control the narrative as to his military prowess. He was a man who could turn disaster into triumph with a well-placed word or a cleverly spun bulletin. His campaigns were as much about perception as they were about strategy, a blend of bravado, brilliance, and blunder. As we wrap up this chapter of Napoleon's military escapades, it's clear that he was a master at turning the tides of fortune to his advantage, whether that meant switching allegiances, adapting tactics on the battlefield, or charming the right political allies. Napoleon's saga is one of transformation, ambition, and a relentless pursuit of greatness, no matter the odds or the height jokes. Stay tuned, because the saga of Napoleon Bonaparte is just getting started, and trust me, it's a tale that stands tall in the annals of history. And so, the tale of Napoleon marches on, from military maverick to the man who would crown himself emperor. Let's dive into the maneuverings that took him from General Bonaparte to the Emperor of the French, a title that sounds as grand in French as it does suspiciously like a power grab in any language. By the time 1804 rolled around, Napoleon had decided that first consul for life just didn't have the right ring to it. It was like settling for the silver medal when you knew you could nab gold. So, in one of history's most ostentatious rebranding exercises, Napoleon took that final step up the ladder of power. The coronation itself was a spectacle worthy of a Netflix drama series. Napoleon orchestrated it with the flair of a theater director who knows how to work an audience. On December 2, 1804, within the hallowed walls of Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon did the unthinkable. He famously took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. Talk about a power move. It was as if he was saying, "Thanks for coming, Your Holiness, but I'll take it from here." This act was both symbolic and strategic, asserting that his authority came not from divine right, but from his own sheer will and the support of the French people, or at least those not currently sharpening their guillotines. But while the gilded crown and imperial robes made for great optics, the real power lay in the Napoleonic Code. Ah, the Napoleonic Code. Sounds like the name of a spy thriller, doesn't it? In reality, it was a legal revolution. Established in 1804, this civil code was Napoleon's attempt to drag France's legal system out of the medieval muck and into the modern era. It was a radical overhaul, with over 2,000 articles detailing everything from property rights to family law. The Napoleonic Code was like the IKEA assembly manual for modern civil law, and it was so effective that it became the basis for legal systems across the globe. Talk about leaving a legacy. Yet, while Napoleon was busy writing the rulebook, he was also rewriting the rules of governance. The code may have been progressive, but Napoleon's rule was anything but. His government was a curious blend of meritocracy and autocracy. He promoted officials based on ability rather than birth, which was revolutionary for its time. But let's not get carried away with the reformer image. Napoleon's idea of modernization came with a hefty dose of authoritarianism. He centralized power, censored the press, and maintained a secret police force that would make George Orwell raise an eyebrow. It was like he was saying, "I'm all for liberty, as long as it's on my terms." And speaking of terms, let's talk about alliances and rivalries. Napoleon's reign was defined by a series of complex relationships that would make any soap opera look tame. Britain was his perennial nemesis, the Joker to his Batman, if you will. The two nations were locked in an ongoing struggle for dominance, with Britain throwing a spanner in Napoleon's works at every opportunity. Then there was Russia, led by Tsar Alexander I, a man who was as enigmatic as he was unpredictable. Napoleon initially cozied up to Russia with the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, thinking he'd found a new bestie. But alliances in Europe were as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. Napoleon's attempts to enforce the continental system, a fancy term for his economic blockade against Britain, were another chapter in this saga of rivalry. The idea was to cripple Britain's economy by cutting off its trade with Europe. In practice, It was about as effective as using a paper towel to stop a flood. Britain's navy was too strong, and smuggling was rampant. Meanwhile, European economies suffered, and resentment towards Napoleon grew faster than his empire. While Napoleon was busy trying to outmaneuver Britain, his relationship with Russia turned frosty. By 1812, the bromance was over. Napoleon's decision to invade Russia was a blunder of epic proportions, a classic example of biting off more than you can chew. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. That's a story for another day. For now, let's focus on how these alliances and rivalries shaped Napoleon's reign. Napoleon's political maneuvers were as much about survival as they were about expansion. He understood that to maintain his empire, he had to keep his enemies guessing and his allies on their toes. This meant a constant shuffle of treaties, marriages, and military alliances. The map of Europe was a chessboard, and Napoleon fancied himself the grandmaster. But with every move, the stakes grew higher, and the line between strategy and sheer bravado blurred. So, where does this leave us? Napoleon was a man of contradictions, a visionary who could be as ruthless as he was reformative, a leader whose ambitions were matched only by his audacity. His rise to emperor was a testament to his cunning, his ability to exploit the chaos of the times, and his relentless pursuit of power. Yet, beneath the surface of grand titles and sweeping reforms lay the reality of autocratic rule and the ever-present shadow of conflict. As we pause in this chapter of Napoleon's saga, remember that history is rarely black and white. It's a tapestry of ambition, power, and the human condition, woven with threads of triumph and tragedy. Napoleon's story is far from over, and as we look ahead to the next act, one thing is certain. The emperor's legacy will loom large, casting a shadow that stretches far beyond the borders of his empire. Stay tuned, because the drama, the intrigue, and the sheer spectacle of Napoleon's reign continue to unfold, with lessons as relevant today as they were 2 centuries ago. The shadow of Napoleon's empire loomed large, but as any history buff can tell you, shadows have a way of stretching just before they disappear. The year was 1812, and Napoleon was about to discover that his Russian adventure would be less of a grand tour and more of a grim march into oblivion. You see, Napoleon's decision to invade Russia wasn't just a misstep. It was like jumping into a pool without checking for water first. The Grand Armée, a veritable juggernaut of over 600 men, set off with all the pomp and circumstance of a peacock parade, ready to teach Tsar Alexander a lesson in Napoleonic diplomacy, because nothing says, let's talk, like an army the size of a small country. But the Russian campaign was less a demonstration of Napoleon's brilliance and more a showcase of his hubris. The plan was simple: march in, defeat the Russians decisively, and be back in Paris in time for croissants. What Napoleon didn't account for was the Russian strategy of scorched earth and relentless retreat. The Russians, not exactly naive to military tactics, turned the land into a barren wasteland, torching crops and villages as they fell back. For Napoleon's troops, it was like chasing a phantom across a landscape that was empty of everything except misery. Then there were the logistics. Oh, the logistics. The Grand Armée quickly discovered that the Russian roads were less highway and more muddy quagmire. Supply lines stretched longer than a French baguette, and wagons bogged down in the thick, cloying muck. The army, initially buoyed by dreams of glory, soon found itself fighting not just the Russians, but hunger, disease, and the brutal Russian winter. Let's just say the only thing colder than the weather was the realization that they were woefully unprepared. By September 1812, the army reached Moscow, only to find it abandoned and burning, courtesy of the Russians' own scorched earth policy. Napoleon, ever the optimist, had anticipated a triumphant entry into the city, complete with adoring crowds and a peace treaty. Instead, he got a smoldering ghost town and a harsh wake-up call. The Russian winter descended with a vengeance, temperatures plummeting to -30 degrees Celsius. If Napoleon's men thought they'd seen hardship before, they were in for a chilling surprise. The infamous retreat from Moscow was less of a retreat and more of a rout. Starvation was rampant, and frostbite claimed more limbs than enemy bullets. It was said that the road back to France was littered with the bodies of men and horses, frozen in grotesque tableau of agony. And yet, amidst the tragedy, there were moments of dark humor. Soldiers reportedly joked that they were the only army to have marched to its own funeral. The retreat was a grim reminder that in war, nature is often the deadliest foe. Napoleon's ambitions reshaped Europe's map, but at a staggering human cost. The Russian campaign decimated his Grande Armée, with only about 27,000 soldiers staggering back across the Niemen River. That's a survival rate lower than your average reality TV star's chance of maintaining relevance. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe smelled blood in the water. The Sixth Coalition, a veritable who's who of European powers including Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, saw an opportunity to topple Napoleon once and for all. As the coalition forces amassed, Napoleon scrambled to raise a new army. He tapped into France's remaining resources with the desperation of a gambler betting it all on one last throw of the dice. By 1813, Napoleon had cobbled together another army, but it was a shadow of its former self. Young conscripts and hastily trained recruits, a patchwork quilt of the untested and the unwilling. The coalition wars were a brutal slog, full of battles that were as fierce as they were futile. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, known as the Battle of Nations, was the largest clash in Europe prior to World War I. Over 600,000 troops clashed in a chaotic melee, and this time Napoleon was on the losing side. The economic context of Napoleon's downfall can't be ignored. The continental system had drained the French economy, and the costs of endless warfare were finally taking their toll. France was bleeding resources, the treasury as empty as a promise from a used car salesman. Napoleon's empire, once a testament to his genius, was crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. Yet, despite the grim realities, the myth of Napoleon continued to captivate. Here was a man who had risen from obscurity to rule an empire, a tale as irresistible as it was improbable. The romantic allure of Napoleon, the charismatic leader, the brilliant strategist, endured even as the harsh realities of his reign came to light. It's a testament to our love of legends, the way we embrace the narrative even when the facts tell a different story. As 1814 dawned, Napoleon was cornered, his empire unraveling faster than a poorly knit sweater. The coalition forces pressed into France, and the end game was in sight. But Napoleon, ever the fighter, refused to go down without a struggle. He launched a desperate campaign to defend France, a whirlwind of battles and maneuvers that showcased the last flickers of his military brilliance. It was a valiant, if ultimately doomed, effort. By April, Paris fell, and the dream was over. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. It was a moment as poignant as it was inevitable. The emperor, who had once crowned himself in Notre Dame with all the confidence of a man who thought he could conquer the world, was now exiled to the island of Elba, a tiny rock in the Mediterranean. It was a fall from grace that rivaled Icarus, and like the mythical figure, Napoleon's ambition had ultimately been his undoing. Yet, even in exile, the legend of Napoleon refused to die. He was down, but not out, and the story was far from over. But for now, as we pause on the brink of his first fall, remember that history is a tapestry of triumphs and tragedies, woven with threads of ambition and audacity. Stay tuned, because the saga of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican who conquered Europe, is not yet finished. And so, Napoleon found himself on Elba, a Mediterranean island that was less paradise and more gilded cage. It was 1814, and while the island's palm trees swayed gently in the sea breeze, Napoleon was plodding, his restless mind churning with possibilities. Elba was no prison cell. Napoleon was made the island's ruler, complete with a ceremonial guard and a small navy. But let's be real, for a man who once ruled Europe, it was akin to swapping a mansion for a garden shed. Napoleon busied himself with local reforms and infrastructure projects, perhaps to stave off the boredom that comes with having once been the master of one's own destiny, and now being the master of goats and fishermen. But here's where the story takes a classic twist. Just 10 months into his exile, Napoleon seized the moment amidst the political chaos back in France. The Bourbon monarchy, restored to power, was about as popular as a skunk at a garden party. King Louis Roman XVIII, bless his heart, tried to roll back the clock to a time before the Revolution, a move about as successful as shoving toothpaste back into the tube. Discontent simmered, and Napoleon, ever the opportunist, sensed a chance to reclaim his throne. In February 1815, Napoleon made his move. He slipped away from Elba with a small band of loyal followers and landed on the French coast near Cannes. This marked the beginning of the 100 Days, a whirlwind period that would see Napoleon reclaim his empire faster than a Hollywood reboot. As he marched toward Paris, soldiers sent to arrest him instead defected to his cause, like moths drawn to a flame. Napoleon's charisma was as magnetic as ever, turning potential conflict into triumphant reunions. By March 20, he entered Paris to the cheers of the crowd, Louis Roman XVIII having fled to Belgium in a panic. Napoleon was once again the emperor, proving that in politics, as in comedy, timing is everything. But Napoleon's second act was short-lived, a blink-and-you'll-miss-it passage in the annals of history. The Allied powers, none too thrilled about his surprise comeback, swiftly declared him an outlaw. They formed the Seventh Coalition, a who's who of Europe's military might, determined to end Napoleon's reign once and for all. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine the fate of Europe, a clash as inevitable as it was epic. Enter the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815. It was a battle that would go down in history, not just for its scale, but for its significance. Napoleon, leading an army of around 73,000, faced off against the Duke of Wellington's 68,000 Allied troops, with the Prussian army marching to join the fray. The battlefield, near the Belgian town of Waterloo, was a muddy quagmire, rain-soaked and unforgiving. The battle was a brutal affair, with cannon fire and musket volleys creating a cacophony of destruction. Napoleon, ever the tactician, attempted to break the Allied lines with a series of aggressive assaults. Yet, for all his brilliance, Napoleon was undone by a combination of factors: the delayed arrival of Marshal Grouchy's reinforcements, Wellington's tenacity, and the timely arrival of the Prussians under Marshal Blucher turned the tide against him. By the end of the day, Napoleon's forces were in disarray, and he was forced to retreat. It was the end of the line for the emperor, a sobering reminder that even legends have their limits. The battle claimed around 25,000 French casualties and 23,000 Allied, a staggering toll that underscored the cost of ambition. After Waterloo, Napoleon's luck finally ran out. He abdicated for the second time on June 22, 1815, and this time there was no Elba on the horizon. He surrendered to the British and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, a place so isolated that even the birds probably felt a little lonely. There, Napoleon spent his final years, writing memoirs and reflecting on his meteoric rise and fall. But here's the twist in the tale. While Napoleon lived out his days in exile, his legend only grew. He became a symbol of romantic heroism, a figure of fascination and myth. How does a man so often vilified in his time become a romantic icon? Perhaps it's the allure of the underdog, the tale of a man who rose from obscurity to shape the world, only to be brought low by his own ambition. Or maybe it's the enduring human love for tales of redemption and downfall, the drama of a hero's journey with all its highs and lows. Napoleon's legacy is as complex as the man himself. In France, he left an indelible mark with the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that still influences modern legal systems worldwide. His administrative reforms modernized the French state, fostering a sense of national unity and identity. Yet, his reign was also marked by autocracy and warfare, a relentless pursuit of power that reshaped Europe's political landscape, but at a tremendous human cost. In the realm of military strategy, Napoleon's influence is undeniable. His tactics, emphasizing speed, surprise, and decisive action, revolutionized warfare and are studied in military academies to this day. He was a master of logistics and maneuver, able to move armies with a precision that baffled his opponents. Yet his downfall serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of overreach and the limits of ambition. As we reflect on Napoleon's saga, it's clear that his story is a mirror held up to the human condition, a tale of ambition, genius, and the inexorable pull of destiny. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican who conquered Europe, remains a figure of endless fascination, a testament to the heights of human achievement and the depths of human folly. His legacy, like his life, is a complex tapestry of triumphs and tragedies, woven with threads of ambition, audacity, and the relentless march of history. In the end, Napoleon's tale is a reminder that history is not just the story of great men and their deeds, but of the world they shape and the people they affect. As we close the book on this chapter of history, one thing is certain. Napoleon's shadow looms large, a testament to the enduring power of myth and the timeless dance of power and ambition. So here's to Napoleon, a man who stood small in stature, but cast a giant shadow across the pages of history. You're waking up in a world where your morning coffee is more likely to involve ale than espresso, and the aroma of fresh bread is mixed with something more earthy. Welcome to the medieval market, a place where the sensory overload hits you like a knight's lance on an unlucky tournament day. The air is thick, and not just with the smell of livestock. You've got the bleating of sheep, the clucking of chickens, and let's not forget the traders shouting deals that may or may not be as good as they sound. Now, let's talk about this place. The medieval market is not your average Saturday morning farmer's market. It's an all-out assault on your senses and your wallet. Picture rows of stalls crammed together in a layout that would give modern town planners a heart attack. There's no sterile, corporate organization here. The market sprawls in whatever direction it pleases, like a toddler with a crayon. Here, the concept of quality is as flexible as a jester's joke. You see, guilds were the medieval version of a consumer protection agency, albeit one that might also double as a mafia. These guilds ensured that every blacksmith, baker, and candlestick maker adhered to certain standards. But let's be real, standards back then were not exactly ISO certified. Quality meant that your bread was more likely to be whole grain than whole rat, though neither was guaranteed. In this chaotic wonderland, money is the name of the game, and you better know how to play. A single coin, let's say a silver penny, could buy you a decent meal, or it could vanish faster than a thief in a crowd. Speaking of meals, your options range from a day's worth of bread, likely a tough, dense loaf that could double as a weapon, to a mysterious meat pie. The latter is a gamble that even the most daring of gamblers might balk at. There's no ingredient list here, folks. It's more like a medieval roulette wheel of flavors and potential food poisoning. Let's break down the economics here. In England, around the 1300s, that silver penny might be the equivalent of $20 today. Not a bad sum, right? But don't get too comfortable. Prices fluctuated like the stock market during a crisis. One day you could feast like a king, the next you'd be wondering where all your shiny pennies went. If you were really lucky, you might snag a decent cut of meat for a few pence. But remember, refrigeration was about as likely as a dragon siding, so freshness was a relative term. The market's economic landscape was a microcosm of medieval society itself. Trade wasn't just about goods, it was a social and political dance. Merchants and traders gathered from miles around, bringing not just their wares, but also news, gossip, and maybe even a few tall tales. The market was a hub of information, a medieval Twitter, if you will. Of course, accuracy wasn't guaranteed, but who needs facts when you have a good story, right? As for the layout, well, imagine a labyrinth designed by someone who got bored halfway through and decided to throw in some livestock for good measure. Streets were narrow and winding, often muddy, and lined with stalls that seemed to pop up overnight. There was no rhyme or reason to the placement of goods. You might find a fishmonger next to a blacksmith, the scents mingling in a way that could only be described as unique. Navigating this medieval maze required more than just sharp elbows. It demanded a keen sense of the social hierarchy. You see, not all traders were equal. Some had the backing of powerful guilds, while others were independent, hawking their goods with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested their next meal depended on it, which, quite literally, it did. And let's not forget the role of barter. Coins weren't always king, especially in smaller towns or rural markets. Goods were often exchanged for other goods, services for services. It was a system that required a keen sense of value and sometimes a little creative accounting. The medieval market was a place where you could swap a sack of grain for a pair of shoes, provided you could haggle like a pro. As you wander through this bustling scene, remember that every transaction is a small piece of the much larger economic puzzle. The market isn't just a place to buy and sell. It's a vital organ in the body of medieval society, pumping life and commerce through the veins of towns and villages. And just like any vital organ, when it works, it's a miracle of nature. When it doesn't, well, you might want to avoid those meat pies. By the end of this whirlwind morning, you're likely overwhelmed by the sights, sounds, and smells. You've dodged sheep, sidestepped dubious puddles, and maybe even haggled over a piece of cheese. But don't get too comfortable. This is just the beginning of your day. The medieval market is a place of endless possibilities, where fortunes can change as quickly as the weather. So, hang on to your purse and your stomach, because this historical roller coaster is far from over. As you dodge a particularly enthusiastic piglet on the loose, let's dive into the social dynamics of this medieval marketplace. It's not just a jumble of stalls. It's a microcosm of medieval society itself, with class distinctions as rigid as a corset on a sunny day. The market wasn't a free-for-all. Oh no, it was more like a game of chess, where each piece knew its place and who it could or couldn't trade with. Starting with the big shots, we have the merchants. These folks were the rock stars of the medieval world, minus the leather pants and groupies. They traveled extensively, bringing exotic goods from far-off lands, spices from the East, silks from China, and occasionally a story so tall it could give Jack's beanstalk a run for its money. But before you romanticize their lives, remember, these traders faced more than just the perils of long journeys and dodgy inns. Pirates, highwaymen, and the occasional bout of scurvy were all part of the package. Merchants were the middle class, skilled in the art of negotiation and diplomacy. Their wealth and social status were built on a foundation of risk and reward. They were the bridge between the peasantry and the nobility, their goods greasing the wheels of medieval commerce. But not all merchants were created equal. Some had the backing of powerful guilds, those semi-secret societies that ensured certain trades remained exclusive and lucrative. Think of them as the original club memberships, minus the golf courses. Below the merchants, you had the local traders and peddlers, your everyday Joes and Janes trying to make a living. They sold locally produced goods, bread, cheese, handcrafted items. These folks were the heartbeat of the market, their livelihoods hinging on the coins they could squeeze out of their customers. And here's the kicker. Despite their integral role in the economy, they had none of the glamour and few of the protections afforded to the guild-backed elites. And then there were the peasants, the backbone of medieval society, often left bending under the weight of that very metaphor. For them, the market was both a necessity and a gamble. With minimal resources, they could sell surplus produce or handcrafted goods. But let's be real, they were more likely there to buy than to sell, stretching their hard-earned pennies to feed their families. The market was a lifeline, sure, but one that could snap if prices shifted or crops failed. The nobility, meanwhile, treated the market more like a social event than economic necessity. They'd stroll through the stalls, perhaps buying the odd luxury item, but mostly it was a chance to see and be seen. Their wealth insulated them from the market's whims, their estates producing everything they truly needed. For them, the market was a place to flex their economic muscles and occasionally remind everyone who really ran the show. Now, let's talk logistics. Goods didn't just appear at the market by magic or medieval Amazon Prime delivery. They traveled vast distances, often over months, before reaching the eager hands of traders. Take spices, for example. In the 14th century, nutmeg and cloves were worth their weight in gold, literally. These spices traveled from the Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia, through a perilous network of trade routes known as the Silk Road, finally reaching Europe after months, or even years. The journey wasn't for the faint-hearted. Caravans laden with goods trekked through deserts, over mountains, and across seas. The travel time between Venice and Constantinople, for example, could take several weeks to several months, depending on weather and the political climate. Imagine trying to keep a shipment of fabric dry and vermin-free in those conditions. No wonder prices were sky-high by the time the goods reached the market. But let's not ignore the dark side. The medieval market was a hotbed for theft, disease, and all manner of unsavory elements. Pickpockets thrived in these crowded spaces, their fingers quicker than a court jester's wit. And if you thought shoplifting was a modern problem, think again. Stallholders had to keep a hawk's eye on their goods, lest they disappear into someone's cloak. Then there was disease. With so many people crammed into tight spaces, sanitation was, shall we say, not a priority. The open sewers and animal waste were a breeding ground for all sorts of nasties. It's no wonder plagues spread like gossip in a royal court. the Black Death itself, which wiped out up to 60% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, found markets to be particularly fertile ground. Despite the risks, the medieval market was an essential part of life. It was a place of commerce, yes, but also a hub of social interaction and cultural exchange. The market brought people together in a way few other places could. It was a melting pot of dialects, customs, and ideas, sort of like a medieval version of Reddit, but with more shouting and less anonymity. So, as you wander through this medieval maze, remember that every deal struck and every coin exchanged is part of a larger story, a story of adventure, risk, and survival. The market was much more than a place to buy and sell goods. It was a stage where the drama of medieval life unfolded in all its glory and grime. And just like any good story, it left an indelible mark on the pages of history, shaping the world we know today in ways both obvious and obscure. Keep your wits about you and your purse even closer, because in this medieval market, fortunes are as unpredictable as the weather, and you're just one haggling session away from a feast or famine. The day's only just begun, and there's much more to uncover in this bustling, chaotic, and endlessly fascinating world. But before we dive into the post-lunch market shenanigans, let's hope you've dodged the culinary landmines. You see, medieval markets were as much about the food as they were about, well, trying not to die from the food. Picture this, a smorgasbord of scents wafting through the air, some appetizing, others, let's say, an acquired taste. First up, the bread. It's the cornerstone of any medieval diet, the good old carb of choice. But don't expect any fluffy, artisanal loaves here. Your average medieval bread was dense, dark, and about as inviting as a brick. Made primarily from rye or barley, it was designed to last, not to delight. The good news, it was often fortified with less than desirable ingredients like ground-up peas or beans in tough times, adding even more heft to each bite. Think of it as the medieval version of whole grain, but with fewer health benefits and more dental hazards. Moving on to meats. If you're lucky enough to snag some, it's likely cured or smoked. Fresh meat was rare and a tad unpredictable, thanks to a lack of refrigeration and an abundance of flies. Pork, beef, and mutton were on the menu, but so were less glamorous proteins like pigeon or rabbit. The noble chicken made an occasional appearance, but only if you were willing to part with a hefty sum, or if you fancied a bit of foul play in the form of theft. A pig might fetch you a price equivalent to a month's wages, showing just how prized these meats were. And let's not forget fish, the medieval fasting staple. Salted, dried, or smoked, fish was the Gouda for those observing religious dietary restrictions. Herring, cod, and eel were popular choices, but freshness was a roll of the dice. Some fish traveled hundreds of miles from the coast to the market, not wrapped in ice, but in a prayer that the smell wouldn't give it away. Vegetables were more of a supporting cast than the stars of the show. Turnips, leeks, and onions were common, seasoned with herbs like dill, parsley, or thyme. And here's where it gets dicey. In the absence of modern food safety standards, overripe or spoiled veggies might find their way into a stew, turning your meal into an intestinal adventure. Now, if you feel like living dangerously, the medieval market offered some culinary peculiarities that would make even the most adventurous foodies pause. Enter the humble pie, a dish that concealed more secrets than a court intrigue. These weren't the sweet pastries you might be dreaming of. A medieval pie was a vessel of mystery meat, possibly involving parts of an animal you'd rather not think about. The appeal. It masked the flavor of less than fresh ingredients with a blend of spices, assuming, of course, you could afford them. Speaking of spices, they were the bling of the medieval table, a testament to both wealth and culinary creativity. The likes of black pepper, saffron, and cinnamon were hoarded like treasures, each pinch a reminder of the distant lands they hailed from. They were used liberally to disguise the taste of food that might have been past its prime. Saffron, in particular, was worth its weight in gold and used sparingly, if at all, by those without deep pockets. Let's not overlook the beverages that washed down these questionable meals. Ale was the drink of choice, the medieval equivalent of soda, consumed by everyone from toddlers to the elderly. It was safer than water, which, let's be honest, was an open invitation to all sorts of diseases. Wine was available too, though more common in regions where grapes could be grown. But don't picture yourself sipping a fine Merlot. Medieval wine was often spiced and sweetened, more akin to mulled wine than anything you'd find in a sommelier's collection. As for market regulations, well, they were as predictable as the English weather. In theory, local authorities imposed rules to ensure fairness and quality. Bakers, for example, had to adhere to the assize of bread, a regulation dictating the weight and price of bread based on grain costs. Violate these rules, and you might find yourself in the stocks, a public spectacle that was more effective than a bad Yelp review. But these regulations were about as consistently enforced as a medieval parent's bedtime curfew, good intentions, but often ignored. The absence of health inspectors meant food safety was largely based on trust and reputation. Stallholders relied on repeat customers, and word of mouth was the medieval version of Google reviews. Market officials, known as ale carners or bread wardens, occasionally checked the quality of goods, but their inspections were more symbolic than systematic. In many cases, it was your own nose and eyes that would tell you what was safe to eat. Yet, despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, the medieval market was a culinary playground, a place where innovation and desperation met. The need to preserve food led to ingenious methods of smoking, curing, and pickling. The absence of refrigeration spurred the development of spices as both preservatives and flavor enhancers. It was a time when necessity wasn't just the mother of invention, it was the head chef, too. As the afternoon sun begins its slow descent, casting long shadows over the bustling stalls, you find yourself reflecting on the remarkable resilience and resourcefulness of medieval society. In a world fraught with uncertainty, food was both a sustenance and a gamble, each bite a reminder of the delicate balance between survival and delight. So, as you wrap your taste buds around the medieval market's fare, remember that every meal was an act of courage, a testament to the enduring human spirit. And as you navigate this culinary landscape, you're not just tasting history, you're living it, one suspiciously seasoned bite at a time. As you mull over the medieval market's edible gambles, your ears are suddenly drawn to a raucous burst of laughter nearby. Ah, yes, the entertainment. Welcome to the afternoon sideshow, where jesters, jugglers, and minstrels transform the marketplace into a medieval multiplex. But before you get too cozy with the idea of medieval merriment, let's unpack the reality beneath the bells and whistles. First off, the role of entertainment in these bustling bazaars was less about delight and more about diversion. Let's face it, the medieval market was as much a place of toil as it was of trade. For the average peasant, life was a relentless cycle of labor, so these performers were akin to a primitive Netflix, offering a much-needed escape from the mundane grind of daily existence. But were these spectacles truly captivating or merely a convenient distraction? It's a mixed bag, much like the contents of those questionable meat pies. Jesters, the rock stars of this era, were always a crowd favorite. With their colorful garb and acerbic wit, they would mark everyone from the lowliest peasant to the haughtiest noble, a rare moment when social hierarchy took a backseat to humor. Yet their role went beyond mere jest. Jesters often doubled as unofficial news anchors, weaving political commentary and current events into their routines, medieval satire, if you will. Laughing at authority was a safe proxy for questioning it, allowing common folk to vent their frustrations without landing in the stocks. Jugglers, meanwhile, dazzled audiences with feats of dexterity, tossing balls, knives, or flaming torches in what might be history's earliest form of multitasking. Their performances were not just about skill, but about defying the odds, much like surviving a trip to the market itself. Imagine a juggler dropping a flaming torch. It's the medieval equivalent of a YouTube fail video. The thrill lay in the potential for chaos, a metaphor for the unpredictability of life in those times. Minstrels and troubadours added a musical score to this vibrant tableau. Armed with lutes or lyres, these wandering musicians spun tales of heroism and romance, often embellishing the exploits of knights and ladies to the point where fact and fiction blurred like a poorly copied manuscript. Their songs were the medieval version of pop hits, catchy and often recycled, with themes of love, betrayal, and adventure. But don't be fooled by the romantic allure. These tunes also served as vehicles for propaganda, spreading tales that bolstered the reputations of patrons who paid well for a flattering melody. Now, let's shift gears and dive into the legal and political implications of these gatherings. You see, a medieval market was not just a freewheeling circus. It was governed by a set of rules as complex as a troubadour's love song. Market charters, essentially medieval business licenses, granted the right to hold markets and fairs, issued by the local lord or the king. These charters were serious business, outlining everything from stall placement to the types of goods that could be sold. They were the bureaucratic backbone of the market, ensuring that commerce flowed as smoothly as possible in a world where smooth was often an optimistic term. But here's the kicker. These charters could also be a double-edged sword. While they provided structure, they also concentrated power in the hands of a few. The issuing of a charter often involved a hefty fee and a fair bit of political maneuvering. It wasn't just about commerce, it was about control. Market days were tightly regulated, and breaking the rules could result in fines, imprisonment, or worse. It was a system that both facilitated trade and reinforced the social hierarchy, where the rich got richer and the peasants got, well, distracted by jesters. Occasionally, things didn't go as planned, and the market turned into more of a battleground than a bazaar. Market riots were not uncommon, sparked by everything from unfair pricing to disputes over trade rights. Imagine being a peasant who saved up all year, only to find your hard-earned pennies don't stretch as far as they should. Frustration boiled over into chaos, and the very authorities meant to keep order found themselves dodging more than just rotten vegetables. One infamous incident occurred in 1272 in Boston, England, a market riot that erupted over a dispute between local and foreign traders. The locals, feeling squeezed out by their more prosperous counterparts, took matters into their own hands, leading to a full-scale melee that left several seriously injured and the market in disarray. It was a stark reminder that the market was not just an economic engine, but a pressure cooker of social tensions. In these moments of unrest, the jesters' laughter and the jugglers' torches seemed like mere whispers against the roar of angry crowds. But even in chaos, there was a strange sense of community, a reminder that beneath the rigid social structures, everyone was subject to the same whims of fate. So, as you navigate the medieval market with its blend of spectacle and strife, remember that entertainment was not just a distraction, but a coping mechanism. It was the medieval version of saying, keep calm and carry on, when everything around you was anything but calm. Each jest, each juggled ball, was a fleeting escape from the harsh realities of a world that was as unpredictable as a jester's punchline. And with that, the afternoon sun begins to cast longer shadows, hinting at the close of another day in this bustling medieval microcosm. But don't let the fading light fool you. The market's pulse beats on, setting the stage for the next chapter in this endlessly fascinating tale of human enterprise and endurance. Stay tuned, because the saga of the medieval market is far from over, and there's more to uncover as the day moves into its final act. As the sun dips below the horizon, the medieval market begins to wind down, the once cacophonous chorus of haggling and laughter slowly giving way to the softer sounds of packing up and heading home. It's the end of a long, chaotic day, a day that has, let's be honest, left you more exhausted than a knight after a jousting tournament. But before you retreat to your hopefully vermin-free bed, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned from this whirlwind tour of medieval commerce. First, let's tackle the romanticized vision of the medieval market, that quaint and colorful scene often depicted in movies and storybooks. The truth is, while there was plenty of color, it was more likely to come from the mud splattered on your tunic than from any picturesque tapestry of merchant stalls. The market was a place of business, not a medieval Disneyland. Sure, there was a certain charm to the chaos, but it was a charm born more of necessity than design. In reality, these markets were the bustling heart of the medieval community, but they were also a microcosm of its broader societal challenges, inequality, unpredictability, and a constant struggle for survival. Economically speaking, the medieval market was the engine that kept the town running. It was a place where the simplest exchange of a few pence for a loaf of bread was part of a much grander economic tapestry. This was capitalism in its infancy, folks, a world where the price of a pig could make or break a family's fortune. Consider this. A pig might sell for about 3 shillings in the 14th century, roughly equivalent to a month's wages for a laborer. The stakes were high, and every transaction was a gamble. The market was the medieval answer to Wall Street, but with more manure underfoot and fewer suits. Let's not forget the social dynamics at play. The market was a great leveler, a place where nobles and peasants rubbed shoulders, albeit rarely on equal terms. For the peasantry, this was a chance to glimpse a world beyond the confines of their village, to hear news from afar, and maybe, just maybe, to dream of a better life. For the nobility was a chance to flaunt their wealth and perhaps indulge in a bit of conspicuous consumption. But make no mistake, the stratification was real, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots was as wide as a castle moat. Politically, markets were hotbeds of intrigue and power plays. Market charters, those precious documents that allowed towns to hold markets, were the keys to economic prosperity and were jealously guarded. They were often granted by kings or powerful lords, and obtaining one could elevate a town from obscurity to prominence. But they also reinforced the feudal hierarchy, ensuring that power remained firmly in the hands of the few. It was a world where the rules of commerce were as rigid as the lords who enforced them, and where breaking those rules could lead to more than just a slap on the wrist. Now, if we peel back the layers of history, we see how the legacy of these markets has shaped our modern world. The concept of a centralized marketplace, where goods and services are exchanged, is one of the fundamental building blocks of our global economy. The medieval market laid the groundwork for the bustling city centers we see today, where commerce flows as freely as ale at a medieval feast. Those early markets were the precursors to our modern shopping malls and online platforms, places where goods from around the world come together in a single space. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the medieval market is its role as a community hub. Beyond the buying and selling, the market was a place of connection, where people came together, exchanged ideas, and forged relationships. It was a place where news traveled faster than a messenger on horseback, where gossip was as valuable as goods, and where the pulse of the community could be felt in the very air. Today, we see echoes of this in our community centers, farmers' markets, and social media platforms, spaces where commerce and community intersect. In the end, the medieval market was a place of contradictions, a blend of the romantic and the harsh, the traditional and the innovative. It was a world where fortunes could be made and lost, where laughter and tension coexisted, and where the very fabric of medieval life was woven together in a tapestry as rich and varied as the goods on offer. So, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps pondering whether that meat pie was a wise choice, remember that the story of the medieval market is much more than a tale of trade. It's a story of human resilience, of survival against the odds, and of the timeless quest for a better tomorrow. And as the echoes of the past fade into the night, know that the lessons of the medieval market continue to resonate, reminding us that in the grand bazaar of life, the greatest currency is not coins or goods, but the connections we make along the way. So, you're a 10-year-old in medieval Europe, and congrats. Your parents have just signed you up for life's grittiest unpaid internship, the Apprenticeship. Forget about cozying up with a video game console or whining about algebra. Instead, you're about to master the art of fetching water, sweeping floors, and oh yeah, maybe learning a trade if your master is feeling particularly generous. Let's break down how you got here. Your folks probably weren't sipping lattes while scrolling through job boards. Nope, they were busy ensuring you didn't end up as a wandering vagabond or worse, a poet. Enter the Apprenticeship, a medieval rite of passage where children as young as 10 were packed off to live with a master craftsman. And when I say packed off, I mean literally handed over like a medieval Amazon package, but without the option for returns. The deal was simple, at least on parchment. You'd sign a contract. Well, your parents would, unless you were some kind of prodigy lawyer child, binding you to a master for a solid 7 years or more. That's right, a commitment longer than most modern marriages. In return, you get to learn a trade. Sounds fair, right? Except, spoiler alert, the learning part was buried under heaps of menial tasks, and the trade could often be summed up as surviving the daily grind. Now, don't be fooled by romanticized tales of apprentices sculpting masterpieces by candlelight. Your average day started when the rooster was still hitting snooze. You'd haul yourself out of bed, usually a straw mat tossed in the corner, and get cracking. First task, fetch water from the local well, which was conveniently located a mile away. Because why not start your day with a medieval marathon? Once hydrated, your job list ranged from sweeping the shop floor to running errands that would make a modern intern's coffee seem like a luxury. And let's not forget the glamorous task of cleaning up after your master's late-night inspiration sessions, which usually left the workshop looking like a tornado with a passion for sawdust had blown through. But hey, you weren't just a glorified janitor. Occasionally, you got to watch your master at work, honing skills that, with any luck, you'd master by the time your contract ended. This was your golden ticket to someday joining the prestigious ranks of the guilds, medieval Europe's answer to a LinkedIn badge. Guilds controlled trade secrets like they were guarding the Holy Grail, and apprenticeship was your only way in. However, let's not kid ourselves. For every hour spent watching your master, you probably spent 5 scrubbing his tools. In the grand social hierarchy, you were somewhere between a servant and a piece of furniture. Room and board were your only rewards, and believe me, room was a generous term. You'd likely share a cramped space with other apprentices, each competing for the title of worst snorer. As for board, let's just say your meals wouldn't make the cut on a medieval cooking show. Think gruel, maybe some bread, and if the stars aligned, a slice of meat. Not gourmet, but hey, it beat starvation. Now, why did society think this was a good idea? Well, in an era where a stable job was as elusive as a dragon, apprenticeships were the medieval answer to career stability. They were the stepping stone to becoming a journeyman and eventually a master yourself. Here's the catch. The road was paved with blisters and humility. And speaking of humility, imagine being the subject of a master's whims. These guys held the power to make or break your future, and they knew it. If you found yourself under a particularly harsh master, your life could be a real-life episode of Survivor, medieval edition, minus the immunity challenges and with much more manure. But don't get too disheartened. Every now and then, an apprentice would strike gold, learning under a master who actually taught them the ropes of the trade. These rare souls could look forward to a career, a family, and maybe even a modest home. The dream was there. It was just often buried under a pile of dirty laundry. In the end, the life of a medieval apprentice was a mixed bag of harsh realities and hopeful aspirations. It was a world where childhood was traded for survival skills, and the promise of future success was the carrot dangled in front of every young apprentice. So, while it might have sucked to be a medieval apprentice, remember, it was a necessary cog in the wheel of medieval society. And hey, at least you didn't end up as a poet. Now, let's dive into the murky waters of medieval labor laws, or should I say, the lack thereof. If you think modern labor laws are a bureaucratic maze, try navigating the 14th century, where the only law seemed to be don't annoy the master too much. Forget OSHA regulations and paid sick leave. In the medieval world, the concept of worker protection was as mythical as unicorns. Back then, apprentices like you were essentially indentured servants with a slightly better PR team. You see, the apprenticeship system was less about nurturing young talent and more about keeping the wheels of the medieval economy spinning. Masters had the kind of unchecked power that would make a corporate CEO blush. If you were under the thumb of a particularly tyrannical master, your daily existence could resemble a medieval boot camp, minus the motivational speeches. Economically, the system made sense, for everyone except the apprentice, that is. Masters got cheap labor, while towns gained skilled workers without needing to invest resources in training them. You, meanwhile, got to look forward to 7 years of unpaid labor. Yep, you read that right. No paycheck every fortnight to look forward to, just the promise of learning a trade. Hopefully, it was like signing up for a 7-year gym membership, where you do all the cleaning in exchange for the occasional use of the equipment. But hey, at least you didn't have to worry about rent. Your room was included, if you could call a drafty corner with a straw mattress a room, and forget about an all-you-can-eat buffet. Food was basic and often scarce, with bread and pottage being the highlights of your culinary experiences. If you were lucky, your master might toss you a bone, literally. Let's talk about wages, or the comedic absence thereof. In 1350, the concept of a minimum wage was about as real as the tooth fairy. The economic landscape was a bit of a wild west, with currency values fluctuating like the plot of a soap opera. To give you an idea, a skilled craftsman in the 14th century might earn about 2 to 3 pence a day. That's right, your hypothetical future earnings wouldn't even cover a venti latte today. But as an apprentice, you were earning exactly zilch, nada, zero. Your pay was the privilege of someday knowing how to make a shoe or forge a sword. Now, you might wonder why anyone would sign up for this medieval misery marathon. The answer: economic necessity. In a world where the Black Death had recently wiped out a sizable chunk of Europe's workforce, jobs were scarce and stability was king. An apprenticeship promised a future where you could eventually become a master yourself, set prices, and maybe even have an apprentice to boss around. It was the medieval equivalent of climbing the corporate ladder, but with more grime and fewer PowerPoint presentations. And let's not forget the guilds, those secretive clubs of craftsmen who held the keys to the kingdom. Joining a guild was like getting a verified badge on social media, prestigious and crucial for business. But here's the catch. Guilds were the gatekeepers of knowledge and trade secrets. They'd only let you in if you completed your apprenticeship and proved you weren't just another hack with a hammer. So, what was the medieval apprentice really getting out of this deal? A lot of hard work and a crash course in humility. That, and a front row seat to the social dynamics of the time. If you were lucky, your master might recognize your potential and actually teach you something useful. But for most, it was a long and arduous journey with no guarantees. The economic forces at play were as complex as they were unforgiving. The medieval economy was built on agriculture, with towns and cities acting as hubs of trade and craftsmanship. Apprenticeships were a way to keep the crafts alive without financially burdening the towns. Masters got their workshops running smoothly with cheap labor, while the guilds ensured quality control and maintained their tight grip on the market. But don't let the romanticized tales of guilds and craftsmanship fool you. The reality was much more cutthroat. Competition was fierce, and the protection offered by guilds came at a price, usually a hefty membership fee that most apprentices could only dream of paying. Once you became a journeyman, you'd still need to save up to join a guild, all while competing with your fellow apprentices for limited opportunities. So here you were, a cog in the medieval economic machine, juggling the hopes of future success with the stark realities of your current situation. The life of an apprentice might not have been glamorous, but it was a necessary stepping stone in a world where stability was as rare as a sunny day in England. As you scrubbed floors and fetched water, the dream of one day becoming a master kept you going. But until then, you were stuck in the relentlessly challenging role of a medieval go-getter, learning to navigate the treacherous seas of labor laws, or the glaring absence of them. And while it might not have been the most rewarding job, at least you weren't a poet. Now, hold onto your straw hat, because it's time to flip the script a little. While being a medieval apprentice might sound like a prolonged episode of barely surviving, Middle Ages edition, it wasn't all doom and gloom. In fact, compared to some of the other options available for young folks back then, being an apprentice was a bit like scoring an economy class ticket on the medieval social mobility express. Let's start by considering the plight of the serf. If you were a serf, you were essentially tied to the land, like a medieval houseplant, except you didn't get to enjoy the sunshine. Your life was dictated by the whims of the local lord, and the closest you got to freedom was a daydream. Unlike apprenticeships, which at least dangled the carrot of future independence, serfdom was a life sentence. So, in the grand scheme of medieval life, apprenticeships offered a glimmer of upward mobility that serfs could only envy. Apprenticeship was your ticket out of the agrarian grind, a chance to rub elbows with the urban crowd and maybe, just maybe, carve out a life where you didn't have to wake up at 4 a.m. to feed chickens. Now, let's tackle the myth of the master-apprentice relationship, which Hollywood loves to paint as a heartwarming tale of mentorship. In reality, it was more like a medieval reality show, full of drama, power struggles, and the occasional alliance. While some masters were genuinely invested in teaching their apprentices, others were more concerned with squeezing out every last drop of labor. Think less Mr. Miyagi and more Gordon Ramsay on a bad day. The romanticized idea of a kindly master guiding his eager young apprentice through the intricacies of the craft, usually with a twinkle in his eye and a sage piece of advice, was about as common as a unicorn in the Black Forest. But hey, not all masters were tyrants. Some did indeed nurture their apprentices, perhaps because they saw a bit of their younger selves in them, or simply because they needed someone competent to take over the shop someday. These rare partnerships could result in apprentices who genuinely learned their trade and perhaps even gained the respect of their master. Yet, this wasn't the norm. For every success story, there were countless tales of apprentices who endured their masters' tempers and unpredictable demands, learning more about resilience than woodworking. Then there's the illusion of upward mobility that apprenticeships dangled enticingly in front of you, like a medieval carrot on a stick. While it's true that an apprenticeship could lead to a journeyman status, and eventually, if the stars aligned, to becoming a master, it wasn't exactly a guaranteed elevator to success. The road was long and fraught with economic potholes. Even after you completed your apprenticeship, you'd face stiff competition from other journeymen, each vying for the limited number of positions in the guilds. Speaking of guilds, let's dive into their role as both gatekeepers and guardians. Joining a guild was like getting the medieval version of a blue checkmark. It signified you were a legitimate craftsman with the skills and knowledge to back it up. But getting that guild membership was no small feat. It required time, money, and a reputation that said you weren't just another hack with a hammer. The guilds controlled the market with an iron grip, setting quality standards and preventing any one craftsman from undercutting the others. This ensured that everyone got a piece of the pie, albeit a modest one. Now, let's sprinkle in some real-life examples for a bit of flavor. Take Hans Sachs, a German shoemaker who turned his apprenticeship into a cultural legacy. Not only did he master his craft, but he also became a renowned poet and playwright. Talk about breaking the mold. Here was a guy who took his apprentice experience and leveraged it into fame and fortune. Sachs is a rare case of an apprentice who climbed the social ladder, proving that while the odds were long, they weren't impossible. But let's not get too carried away with visions of grandeur. For every Hans Sachs, there were thousands of apprentices whose lives didn't quite turn into a rags to riches tale. The promise of becoming a master was often out of reach, and many found themselves stuck in a cycle of low pay and high expectations. The apprentice-turned-journeyman faced a new set of challenges, from finding steady work to saving enough money to open their own shop. The economic context is key here. The medieval economy wasn't exactly booming. It was a fragile thing, built on agriculture and craftsmanship, with towns acting as hubs of trade. Apprenticeships were a way to sustain these trades without overburdening the system, but they didn't always translate into economic security for the individual. The dream of independence and prosperity often clashed with the harsh realities of limited opportunities and fierce competition. Despite these challenges, the apprenticeship system persisted because it was a cog in the medieval machine, keeping the crafts alive and ensuring a steady supply of skilled labor. It was a necessary evil in a time when stability was a luxury. And while the journey was tough, it offered a glimmer of hope, a chance to rise above your station, to learn a craft, and to maybe, just maybe, make a better life for yourself. So, as you slogged through the daily grind, fetching water and scrubbing floors, you held onto that hope. Because in a world where serfs were bound to the land, and opportunities were as scarce as a warm winter, an apprenticeship was a beacon of possibility. Sure, it came with strings attached and a healthy dose of grit, but it was a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. And while it might not have been the fairy tale we sometimes imagine, it was a crucial stepping stone in the ever-turning wheel of medieval society. As we continue to unravel the tapestry of the medieval apprenticeship, remember that while it was a path paved with toil and tenacity, it was also a testament to the enduring human spirit. The desire to learn, to improve, and to rise above one's circumstances is a story as old as time. And while the apprentices may not have had it easy, their legacy is a reminder of the power of perseverance in the face of adversity. But let's not get too misty-eyed over the resilience of the medieval apprentice, because we've got some juicy drama to dive into. Welcome to the social minefield that was the apprentice world, complete with rivalries that would make high school cliques look like a love-in. Picture a cramped workshop, where you and a handful of other apprentices are all vying for the master's favor like it's the medieval equivalent of The Bachelor. Only instead of roses, you're hoping for a nod of approval or maybe, just maybe, a slightly less rotten piece of bread for dinner. The stakes were high, folks. Securing the master's favor wasn't just about getting a pat on the back. It was about survival. A good word from your master could mean the difference between a future as a respected tradesman or a lifelong career as the guy who sweeps up sawdust. This wasn't just a job. It was your entire future on the line. And let's be real, your fellow apprentices weren't exactly your best buddies. They were your competition, and if they had to step on your fingers to climb the social ladder, well, that was just business. Guilds, those enigmatic medieval trade unions, were supposed to be your allies. In theory, they protected the interests of craftsmen, ensuring fair wages and quality control. In practice, they were as self-serving as your least favorite reality TV villain. Sure, guilds set standards and maintained order in the trade, but their main priority was protecting their own power and influence. Think of them as the medieval version of a high-stakes poker game. If you weren't already in the club, you'd better have a winning hand or be prepared to watch from the sidelines. Let's not forget, guilds were also the guardians of trade secrets with a zeal that would make even the most paranoid tech company blush. If you wanted in, you had to prove you weren't just another hack with a hammer. And that's where the master's favor came into play. Your master's recommendation could be your golden ticket to guild membership, but getting it was no easy feat. It required a delicate balance of hard work, strategic flattery, and the occasional miracle. Now, about those guild politics. These were not your friendly neighborhood associations. They were more like medieval mafia families, minus the horse heads in beds, but with just as much intrigue and power play. Guilds controlled everything from trade practices to pricing, and they had the authority to make or break careers. They were the gatekeepers of success, and if you crossed them, you might as well pack up your tools and head for the hills. And what about the apprentices who had enough of the grind and decided to rebel? Picture this, a group of fed-up young workers, tired of the endless drudgery and the empty promises of future success, banding together to challenge the system. These medieval rebels were the original disruptors, the ones who dared to say, enough is enough. They staged walkouts, formed secret alliances, and sometimes even took to the streets in protest. It was a risky move, but for some, it was the only way to break free from a system that seemed rigged against them. Of course, not all rebellions ended in triumph. Many apprentices found themselves blacklisted by guilds or forced to leave town in search of work. But their actions sent ripples through the system, challenging the status quo and forcing guilds to at least acknowledge their grievances. It was a small step, but in a world where change was as slow as a snail in a tar pit, it was something. Now let's circle back to the master's favor. This was no small thing, my friends. It was a currency of its own in the apprentice world. A good relationship with your master could open doors, while a bad one could slam them shut faster than you could say, artisan. It wasn't just about being the best at your craft. It was about playing the political game, knowing when to speak up and when to keep your head down. In a world where your future depended on the whims of one person, learning to navigate these dynamics was as crucial as mastering your trade. So, there you have it. The turbulent social dynamics of the medieval apprentice world, where every day was a juggling act between skill, politics, and survival. It was a world where alliances were formed and broken, where guilds wielded power like medieval moguls, and where the master's favor was the ultimate prize. It was a tough life, but for those who navigated it successfully, the rewards were worth the struggle. And for those who didn't, well, let's just say there were always more straw mattresses in need of an occupant. As we peel back the layers of this complex system, it's clear that the story of the medieval apprentice is one of ambition, resilience, and a fair bit of luck. It's a reminder that even in the harshest of circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to adapt, to challenge, and to strive for something better. So, while it might have sucked to be a medieval apprentice, the lessons learned were invaluable, and the stories they left behind even more so. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into this fascinating world, because there's plenty more to uncover in the saga of the medieval apprenticeship. So, as we peel back the layers of this complex system, it's clear that the story of the medieval apprentice is one of ambition, resilience, and a fair bit of luck. But let's zoom out a little and see how this medieval rite of passage shaped not just the individuals who lived through it, but society as a whole. You see, apprenticeships weren't just about turning a ragtag group of kids into competent craftsmen. They were the backbone of medieval Europe's entire economic engine. When the Black Death swept through, culling a third of the population, who do you think stepped up to keep the wheels turning? That's right, the apprentices, the journeymen, and the newly minted masters who had slogged through years of hard labor to earn their stripes. The guilds, for all their gatekeeping, were essential in maintaining the quality of goods and services. They were like the medieval Better Business Bureau, ensuring that no charlatan would ruin the reputation of an entire trade. And let's not forget, these guilds were often the early adopters of some form of self-governance, setting the stage for future labor laws. If you think your current job is a treadmill, imagine being stuck in a guild meeting, debating the merits of a new regulation over a tankard of ale. While the guilds were the gatekeepers, they also laid the foundation for organized labor as we know it today. Fast forward to the present, and you might find yourself in an internship or modern apprenticeship. You're probably thinking, well, at least I didn't have to fetch water from a well. But let's get real for a second. Modern apprenticeships and internships can still feel like you're the lowly cog in a big machine. The unpaid internship, a rite of passage for many a college student, is a direct descendant of the medieval apprenticeship, minus the guilds and plus the caffeine addiction. You're still working for little to no pay, hoping that one day you might catch a break and land a full-time gig. But here's where things get interesting. While the medieval apprentice often had to wait 7 years to become a journeyman, today's interns hope to make that jump in a summer. It seems we've traded years of manual labor for a few months of PowerPoint presentations and coffee runs. While the timeline has shrunk, the stakes remain high. In both eras, the goal is to gain skills, make connections, and hopefully not end up living under a bridge. Let's take a look at the economic context. In medieval times, an apprenticeship was a surefire way to secure a trade, and with it, a livelihood. Today, the promise of a stable job has been replaced by the allure of networking and experience. And just like in the medieval days, getting your foot in the door often means navigating a minefield of social dynamics. The modern equivalent of the master's favor might just be a LinkedIn recommendation or a glowing letter of reference. So, how much has really changed? Sure, you're not sleeping on a straw mattress or dining on gruel, but the essence remains. Learning through doing, often with little immediate reward. It's a system that's as old as time, because, despite its flaws, it works. The hands-on experience can't be replaced by textbooks, and the connections you make are often as valuable as the skills you acquire. Now, let's reflect on the human spirit's resilience through all of this. The medieval apprentice had it tough, no doubt about it, but they persevered, driven by the hope of a better future. It's a testament to human determination, and that hasn't changed. Whether you're a medieval apprentice dreaming of opening your own shop someday, or a modern intern hoping to turn that temporary badge into a permanent one, the drive to rise above your current circumstances is universal. In the end, while the medieval apprenticeship system might seem archaic, its legacy lives on. It's a reminder that even when the odds are stacked against us, we find a way to adapt. The medieval apprentices, with their blisters and their dreams, were the unsung heroes of their time. Their struggles and successes have left an indelible mark on history, shaping the way we learn and work even today. So, the next time you find yourself grumbling about the menial tasks of your internship, remember the medieval apprentices who paved the way, one grueling day at a time. They may have started with nothing more than a straw mattress and a head full of dreams, but they helped build the world we live in. And that, my friend, is a legacy worth acknowledging. Here's to the grit, the grind, and the undying hope for a better tomorrow. Cheers to the apprentices, past and present, who prove that while the deal might be raw, the spirit is anything but.